Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable if you can. Maybe you're already in bed. Maybe you're stretched out on the couch. Maybe you're listening with one ear while the room around you goes quiet. Wherever you are, let yourself settle in, because tonight we're going somewhere that does not look grand at first glance. We're not going to a president's office. We're not going to a battlefield with cannons lined up in the grass. We're not going to a courtroom where the marble walls make everyone whisper without meaning to. Tonight, we're going to a narrow street in Greenwich Village, in New York City, in the early hours of a summer morning in 1969. We're going to stand outside a bar with blacked-out windows, a jukebox inside, police wagons at the curb, and a crowd that was supposed to be ashamed of itself. And then, we're going to watch what happened when that crowd decided it had been ashamed long enough. The place was called the Stonewall Inn. If you know that name already, you may know it as landmark, a symbol, a word printed on signs and posters and school lessons and pride banners. But before it became any of those things, it was just a bar, not a clean bar, not a glamorous bar, not the kind of place that would have looked impressive in a magazine spread. It was cramped, poorly maintained, and run by people who were not exactly in the hospitality business for sentimental reasons. The drinks were watered down, the plumbing was bad, the glasses were not always properly washed, the music was loud, the lighting was low, the door was watched carefully because police could come in at any time. And still, people went there. They went there because in a city that had millions of people and very little room for honesty, the Stonewall Inn gave some of them a few hours where they could dance. That is the detail I want you to hold for a moment. Dance. Not make a speech. Not start a movement. Not change the law in a single night. Just dance. A man could dance with a man. Someone could wear clothes that made sense to them, even if the world outside punished them for it. A young person who had been thrown out of home might find other young people leaning against the wall outside Christopher Park and understand, without anyone saying much, that they were not the only one. A lesbian could walk into a room where she was still watched, still at risk, still not exactly safe, but less alone. A drag queen could be visible for a little while. A person who had spent the day measuring every gesture, every word, every glance, could step into the dark and loosen their shoulders. That does not sound like much if you have never had to hide. If you have had to hide, it sounds like air. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. What time is it where you are right now? Is it late enough that the streets outside are quiet? Is there a lamp on beside you, or only the glow of your phone? Are you listening from a bedroom, a kitchen, a train, a night shift, a small town, a big city, some place where history feels very close, or some place where it feels impossibly far away? If you feel like sharing where you're listening from tonight, leave it in the comments. I read those, and I mean that. There is something strangely comforting about knowing that a story from one street in New York can be heard by someone in another room, another country, another life entirely. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history that moves slowly enough to breathe, history that does not rush past ordinary people on its way to famous names, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to do it now. Do it when something lands. Do it when some small detail makes you stop and think, or when you realise that a person you never met has become real to you for a moment. That is usually the best time. Now, let us go back. Not to the riot yet. Not to the shouting, not to the broken glass or the police line or the newspaper headlines that came later. We need to arrive slowly, because Stonewall did not begin the moment a police officer walked through the door. It began years earlier, in the daily pressure that gay Americans lived under. It began in the way a person learned to check a room before speaking. It began in the way a woman might avoid holding another woman's hand in public, not because she lacked courage, but because courage did not pay the rent if she lost her job. It began in the way men were arrested for dancing together, in the way bars were raided, in the way names were printed, in the way families were called, in the way a private life could be destroyed by a single night in the wrong place when the wrong officers came in. This is one of the hardest things for modern people to fully absorb about the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. Being gay was not simply frowned upon. It was not just something people whispered about. It was treated as criminal, immoral, sick, dangerous, and shameful all at once. Laws varied by state and city, but the general message was plain enough. If you were openly homosexual, the world had tools to punish you. The police had tools, employers had tools, landlords had tools, families had tools, doctors had tools, churches had tools, newspapers had tools, and because all of these forces pointed in the same direction, many gay people learned the basic skill of survival, which was concealment. You could live, but you had to edit yourself. You could work, but you had to be careful. You could love, but you had to make sure the wrong person did not notice. There is a particular exhaustion in living that way. Not the exhaustion of one hard day, not the kind you can fix with a good meal and a long sleep, but the kind that builds quietly over years. The exhaustion of using the right pronoun when you talk about someone you love. The exhaustion of changing your voice on the phone. The exhaustion of walking a little differently on one street than you do on another. The exhaustion of smiling through a joke that is really a warning. The exhaustion of knowing that the law does not merely fail to protect you, but may be the thing you need protection from. In New York City, gay bars existed in that tension. They were illegal in practice, even when not illegal by name. The state liquor authority could punish establishments for serving homosexuals, treating their presence as disorderly. Police raids were routine. Owners paid bribes. Patrons learned the habits of fear. When the lights came on suddenly, everyone understood what it meant. Stop dancing. Step apart. Look ordinary if you can. Produce identification. Hope your name does not end up somewhere it should not be. Hope your clothes do not give an officer a reason. Hope your employer does not hear. Hope your parents do not hear. Hope tonight is only humiliating and not worse. And yet, people kept going. That is the part that always makes me stop. They knew the risk and still went out. Not every night, not recklessly, not because they wanted trouble, but because life cannot be lived entirely as an apology. A person needs somewhere to go. A person needs music sometimes. A person needs to stand near others who understand what does not have to be explained. And in the years before Stonewall, when openly gay public life was often forced into shadows, those shadows became crowded with people who were more alive than the world wanted them to be. The Stonewall Inn sat at 51 and 53 Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. The village had long been a place for people who did not fit neatly elsewhere. Artists, writers, leftists, students, drifters, musicians, people with little money and large opinions, people who wanted to live differently, people who had already been told no by some other part of American life. This did not make it paradise. That word gets used too easily. It did not mean the police looked away. It did not mean everyone was kind. It did not mean gay people were safe. But the village had pockets of tolerance, and sometimes a pocket is enough for someone to breathe for one evening. The Stonewall was not the only gay bar in New York, and the Stonewall Uprising was not the first time LGBTQ people fought back against police harassment. That matters. History becomes too neat when we pretend one night created everything by itself. There had been earlier acts of resistance. There had been organisations before Stonewall, meetings before Stonewall, arguments before Stonewall, arrests before Stonewall, brave people before Stonewall. There were gay men and lesbians who stood in picket lines in formal clothes because early activists believed they had to look respectable enough to be heard. There were people who challenged medical authorities, police departments, and newspapers long before most Americans were willing to listen. There were uprisings in other cities, moments when people pushed back because they'd run out of room to retreat. So Stonewall was not the first spark in an empty field. It was more like a match dropped into a room where gas had been leaking for years. That is not poetic. It is practical. Pressure had been building. The late 1960s were already loud with protest. Civil rights activists had forced the country to look at segregation and racial violence. Women were questioning the limits placed on their lives. Students were protesting the Vietnam War. Young people were challenging old rules about sex, authority, clothing, music, language, and public behaviour. The country felt unstable to many Americans, and for people who had been kept at the edge of public life, instability could sometimes create an opening. When a society is already arguing with itself, people who are told to stay silent may choose that moment to speak. Still, no one walking into the Stonewall Inn on the night of June 27th, 1969, could have known exactly what was coming. That is important to remember. We tell history backward, so everything looks inevitable. The police raid looks like the beginning of the uprising because we know the uprising followed. The crowd looks like a movement because we know a movement grew from it. The street looks historic because we know what was later said about it. But to the people there, it was just another hot night at the end of June. Some had worked that day, some had nowhere stable to sleep, some were young enough that the rest of their lives was still mostly a rumour. Some had learned to laugh loudly because laughter could cover fear. Some had been drinking, some had been flirting, some had probably come only because there was music and they did not want to be alone. Picture the room before the raid, not as a monument, not as a museum, just a crowded bar with bodies close together, the air thick, the floor sticky, the jukebox doing its work. The Stonewall had 2 dance floors, and dancing was one of the reasons people came. Imagine what that meant in a time when dancing together could be treated as evidence against you. A dance floor can be a simple thing. A few square feet, a song, someone's hand, someone's shoulder, the small decision not to step away. Under the right conditions, that becomes more than recreation. It becomes proof of existence. You are here. Someone sees you. The music is playing, and for 3 minutes you do not have to explain yourself. Outside, Christopher Street had its own nighttime life. Young people gathered near the park. Some were homeless, some had been rejected by families. Some survived through hustling, small jobs, borrowed couches, favours, luck and stubbornness. These young people are often mentioned quickly in histories of Stonewall, but they should not be hurried past. They were among the most vulnerable people in the city, and vulnerability does not always look quiet. Sometimes it looks like attitude. Sometimes it looks like a joke thrown at a police officer. Sometimes it looks like refusing to move when every practical instinct says move. The street kids of the village knew police harassment well. Drag queens knew it. Trans and gender non-conforming people knew it. Lesbians who did not dress the way officers expected women to dress knew it. Gay men knew it. The people at Stonewall were not all the same, and that matters too. Race, class, gender, age, money, safety, all of these shaped who was most exposed and who could disappear more easily when trouble came. A strange thing happens when a place is unsafe but necessary. People develop rituals around the danger, the peephole at the door, the warning lights, the false names in a book, the quick adjustment when police enter, the practiced expression of boredom, the waiting outside after a raid to see who gets loaded into the wagon. These rituals can make oppression seem routine, almost manageable, until one night the routine breaks. That is the part of Stonewall that still feels difficult to explain. Why that night? Why that raid? Why that crowd? Why did people who had endured so much before suddenly refuse to endure it in the usual way? Historians can point to reasons, and we will. The timing of the raid, the mood of the city, the makeup of the crowd, the anger that had been stored too long, the summer heat, the fact that police did not clear the scene quickly, the fact that people gathered instead of leaving. But even after you list all the reasons, there remains something human at the centre that does not fit neatly into a timeline. Sometimes people obey because they are afraid. Sometimes people obey because they are tired. Sometimes people obey because the cost of refusing is too high. And then, one night, the same people look at the same humiliation and something in them says no. Not a polite no, not a legal brief, not a carefully worded petition, a street-level no. A no made of shouting, laughter, anger, coins thrown, bodies pushing back, people refusing to scatter. A no that did not arrive with a permit. This is part of why Stonewall disturbed people then, and still unsettles people now. It does not fit the clean version of civil rights history that many Americans prefer, the version where progress happens because everyone behaves perfectly, and power simply recognizes its mistake. Stonewall was messy. It involved fear and rage and property damage, and police trapped inside a bar and a crowd that could not be easily described as respectable by the standards of the time. That messiness is not a detail to apologize for. It is part of the truth. People who are denied respectable avenues of being heard do not always sound respectable when they finally make themselves heard. Tonight, though, we are not rushing to the clash. We are standing just before it. We are letting the street become real first. The narrow sidewalks, the warm air, the late hour, the bar door, the police who believed this would be another raid, the patrons who had every reason to expect another round of embarrassment, arrest and dispersal. The neighbours, the onlookers, the young people outside who understood that something was happening and moved closer instead of away. Every major event in history has a moment just before anyone knows it is major. A quiet second before the door opens, a breath before the first shout, a police wagon waiting at the curb, a song cut short. If you have ever had a private part of yourself become public before you were ready, you may understand a little of the fear in that room. If you have ever been laughed at for something you could not change, you may understand a little of the anger. If you have ever found safety in a place that was not truly safe, but was safer than everywhere else, you may understand why people kept coming back to a bar like the Stonewall Inn. And if you have ever reached a point where one more small insult felt larger than all the insults before it, you may understand why history sometimes turns not on a planned speech, but on a crowd that stays. The Stonewall Riots were not the whole story of gay liberation in America. They were not clean. They were not simple. They were not owned by one person, one slogan, one organisation, or one perfect memory. They were a beginning only in the sense that some beginnings are really breaking points. The people on Christopher Street did not create courage out of nowhere. They carried it in with them, hidden under ordinary clothes, tucked into jokes, disguised as survival, sharpened by years of being watched. When the police came in that night, they expected the old pattern. The lights would come on, people would line up, some would be arrested, others would lower their eyes and leave. The bar would be emptied, the report would be written. The city would keep moving as if nothing important had happened. But this time the people did not disappear in the usual way. They waited, they watched, they talked back. The crowd grew, the balance of the night shifted, and somewhere in that shift, on a street that had seen plenty of raids before, gay Americans and the people who stood with them began to do something that power had not prepared for. They fought back. Not because they knew how history would remember them, not because they were certain they would win, not because the world had suddenly become safe. They fought back because the usual silence had become impossible. So let the room around you stay quiet for a moment. Let the modern world soften at the edges if it can. We are going to walk into a time when a person could lose almost everything for being seen too clearly, and then we're going to follow the people who decided, in the heat of one June night, that being seen might be worth the danger. The door of the Stonewall Inn is still closed. The music is still playing. The street outside is not yet a battleground, and for just a little while longer, before the raid begins, we need to understand the world that made a place like this necessary. Before the door of the Stonewall Inn ever opened to the police that night, before the lights came up, before anyone began shouting in the street, before Christopher Street filled with people who had decided not to go home quietly, there was another story already in motion. It was not one night. It was not one bar. It was not one angry crowd appearing out of nowhere. It was years and years of people learning how to live inside a country that told them, in law, in medicine, in religion, in newspapers, in police stations, and often at their own kitchen tables, that their love made them dangerous. To understand why Stonewall mattered, you have to begin there, not with the broken glass, not with the police wagons, not with the chant in the street, but with the ordinary morning of a gay man in 1954, buttoning his shirt for work and deciding before he even left his apartment which parts of himself would have to stay hidden that day. This is the part of the story that can be difficult to slow down enough to feel. We know the public words now: pride, liberation, rights, movement. We know the photographs of marches and banners. We know the shorthand that Stonewall began something modern and loud and visible. But for most gay Americans before Stonewall, life was not loud. It was careful. Careful in the way you answered a question about marriage. Careful in the way you looked at someone across a room. Careful in the way you wrote a letter. Careful in the way you saved a photograph, if you dared to save it at all. A whole life could be built out of caution. You could have a job, a room, friends, a routine, a favourite bar, a person you loved, and still understand that one careless moment could knock the whole structure down. Imagine a young man in Washington, D.C., in the early 1950s. He has a government job, maybe not a grand one, maybe just clerical work, the kind of job that provides a steady paycheck and a reason to wear a tie. He does his work well, he arrives on time, he pays his rent, he calls his mother on Sundays, but he also knows that the federal government is searching for people like him, not because he has betrayed his country, not because he has mishandled documents, not because he has done anything that would make him bad at his job. He is watched because officials have decided that homosexuality itself is a security risk. They say a gay person can be blackmailed. They say secrecy makes him vulnerable. Then they build a system that forces him to keep secrets, and they punish him for the danger their own system created. There is a cruelty in that circular logic that is easy to miss, until you sit with it for a moment. The government made honesty impossible, and then called secrecy proof of guilt. This was the world of the Lavender Scare. It followed alongside the Red Scare, that better-known panic over communism in the early Cold War. But while the Red Scare eventually faded from its most feverish pitch, the official suspicion of gay men and lesbians dug itself deeply into American institutions. Thousands of federal employees were fired, pressured to resign, denied promotion, or kept from jobs altogether because of real or suspected homosexuality. The fear did not stop at government office doors. Contractors, private employers, police departments and families learned the same lesson from the top down. If the government could treat gay people as risks by definition, then any boss, any landlord, any neighbour, any investigator could treat them that way too. The result was not just unemployment, it was a culture of watching, a culture where a rumour had weight, a culture where a police record from one city could follow a man into a personnel office in another, a culture where privacy was not simply personal preference, but survival equipment. Now think about what that did to ordinary daily life. A straight man in 1957 could place a photograph of his girlfriend on his desk and no one would call it evidence. A married woman could mention her husband at lunch and no one would lower their voice. A young couple could hold hands on a park bench and be seen as sweet or ordinary, or perhaps too affectionate but not criminal. A gay person had to think about all of these things. Was the photograph safe? Was the name safe? Was the letter safe? Could a co-worker be trusted? Could a roommate be trusted? Could a doctor? Could a brother? Could a stranger at a bar be an undercover officer? This is the mental labour that rarely appears in official histories because it leaves almost no paperwork of its own. It is the labour of editing the self before the world gets the chance to edit it for you. There was also the medical world, and that is another place where the pressure came with a calm face. For much of the mid-20th century, homosexuality was treated by mainstream psychiatry as a disorder. That mattered. It gave the prejudice of the street the language of expertise. It allowed families to send sons and daughters to doctors not to be understood, but to be corrected. It allowed judges, employers, and military officials to speak as though discrimination had scientific backing. A person might already feel afraid because of the police, ashamed because of church teaching, and isolated because of family rejection, and then be told by a doctor that the deepest truth of their desire was evidence of sickness. I want to be careful here, because not every doctor was cruel, and not every family acted out of hatred. Some people thought they were helping. Some parents genuinely believed they were saving a child from a hard life. But harm can be done with a concerned voice. Sometimes that makes it harder to resist, because the person harming you does not sound like an enemy. They sound like someone who is disappointed for your own good. For lesbians, the danger had its own particular shape. A woman who loved women in the 1950s and 1960s did not live inside the same expectations as a man. She lived inside a world that often measured women through marriage, motherhood, appearance, and dependence on men. A woman who did not marry, or who lived with another woman too long, or who dressed in a way others considered masculine might be noticed. Perhaps not always immediately, perhaps not in every neighbourhood, but enough to make caution necessary. Jobs mattered deeply. A woman supporting herself without a husband already stood slightly outside the expected order, and the wrong rumour could make her more vulnerable. Lesbian bars were raided. Women could be arrested. They could be humiliated, exposed, assaulted, or threatened. And because women's independence itself was often treated as suspicious, lesbian life had to navigate both homophobia and the limits placed on women more generally. There were women who built lasting partnerships, rich friendships, private rituals, and social worlds that outsiders never saw clearly. But many did it quietly, behind drawn curtains, with language that could be denied if someone overheard. There were people whose danger was even more visible. Drag queens, trans people, gender non-conforming people, and anyone whose clothing, walk, voice, or presentation attracted police attention could not hide as easily. The law and police practice often turned appearance into an excuse. Officers could arrest people under rules about clothing, disorderly conduct, loitering, impersonation, or whatever charge seemed useful at the moment. This meant that the street itself could become a test. A person leaving home dressed as themselves might have to calculate not only where they were going, but every block between here and there. Who might shout? Who might follow? Who might call the police? Could they run in those shoes? Did they have bail money? Did anyone know where they were? These are practical questions, not dramatic ones. They are the kinds of questions people ask when their ordinary movement through a city has been turned into a risk. And yet communities formed. This is the thing that keeps the story from becoming only a record of suffering. Gay life before Stonewall was hard, often frightening, often unfair, but it was not empty. People found one another. They always had. In large cities especially, the combination of anonymity and density created room for discovery. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Chicago, Washington, Philadelphia, and other cities held networks that could not be seen from the outside unless you knew where to look. A certain bar, a certain bench, a certain bookstore, a certain party in an apartment where the curtain stayed closed and the music was kept just low enough. A neighbourhood where the rules loosened slightly after dark. A friend who knew a friend who could introduce you to people who would not ask the wrong questions. This is how hidden communities survive. Not always through grand institutions at first, but through directions whispered carefully and trust built slowly. World War II had changed something too. Millions of Americans were moved around by the military, by defence work, by the machinery of war. Young men and women left small towns and found themselves in barracks, factories, ports, offices and cities filled with strangers. Some discovered, maybe for the first time, that their feelings were not unique. Some had relationships. Some found words for themselves. Some returned home and tried to fold themselves back into older expectations, but could not forget that somewhere else, for a little while, they had not been alone. The war did not create gay people, of course. No event does that. but it changed the conditions under which some gay people found one another. It moved bodies into new places. It loosened old supervision. It proved that the private knowledge one person carried might be shared by many. After the war, the pressure increased, even as visibility increased. That is one of the strange contradictions of the period. Gay Americans were becoming more visible as a subject of investigation, journalism, medicine, policing, and gossip, but not necessarily more free. The public heard more about homosexuality, but much of what it heard was distorted by panic. Newspapers reported arrests. Officials spoke about perversion. Popular magazines sometimes treated gay life as a frightening hidden world. Police departments created files. Families read these stories and worried. Young people read them too, and some recognised themselves in the very articles meant to warn against them. That is another quiet irony. A hostile newspaper story might be the first time a lonely teenager realised there were others. The article might condemn, but the existence of the article revealed something. Somewhere, these people were real. Somewhere, they gathered. Somewhere, there was a name for what had felt nameless. Early gay and lesbian rights organisations emerged inside this climate of fear. They did not look like the liberation groups that would come later. They were cautious, formal, and often deeply concerned with respectability. The Mattachine Society, founded in Los Angeles in the early 1950s, gave gay men a structure for discussion, support, legal help, and activism. The Daughters of Bilitis, founded in San Francisco in 1955, gave lesbians an alternative to bars and a way to organise socially and politically, with some measure of privacy. These groups used the word homophile more often than homosexual, partly because it sounded less clinical and less centred on sex. That choice tells you a great deal about the period. Even the language had to be managed. Activists were trying to argue that gay people were citizens, neighbours, workers, taxpayers, respectable adults. They wanted to look steady enough that the public might listen. Men wore suits in picket lines. Women wore dresses. Signs were carefully worded. Anger was present, but often disciplined into a form that would not scare the audience away. There is something moving about that discipline, and also something sad. Imagine having to dress perfectly just to ask not to be fired. Imagine having to speak softly about your own humanity, so that people who already doubt it will not accuse you of being too aggressive. Those early activists were brave, but their bravery often had to pass through a narrow gate. They were not only fighting laws and policies, they were fighting the public image of the homosexual as unstable, predatory, tragic, or ridiculous. Every meeting, every newsletter, every letter to an official, every carefully staged protest had to answer not only the question of rights, but the accusation of existence itself. Are you decent? Are you safe? Are you employable? Are you loyal? Are you sick? Are you a threat? Most citizens never have to prove they are human before discussing whether they should be treated fairly. Gay Americans often did. The bars were different. Not free from danger, not politically pure, not always kind, not always safe, but different. A bar could do what a formal organisation could not always do. It could gather people who were not interested in minutes, committees, newsletters, or cautious public relations. It could gather people who wanted a drink, a dance, a laugh, a touch, a night out. In New York City, many gay bars operated under the control or influence of organised crime because legitimate business owners risked losing liquor licenses or facing police pressure if they served openly gay customers. This meant that gay patrons were exploited even in the places where they found refuge. They paid too much for bad drinks. They endured filthy conditions. They were sometimes treated badly by the very owners who profited from their need for a gathering place. But the alternative was often no place at all. That is one of the hard truths of this history. Marginalised people sometimes find shelter in rooms that take advantage of them, because the respectable world has locked every cleaner door. Police raids were part of the rhythm of gay bar life. patrons learned what to do when the lights came on. Stop dancing. Move away from the person beside you. Check your clothes. Show identification. Wait. The humiliation was not incidental. It was one of the purposes. People might be lined up, questioned, photographed, loaded into wagons. Names could appear in newspapers, and a name in print could do as much damage as a conviction. It could reach a boss, a landlord, a parent, a spouse. For married people living double lives, the threat of exposure was constant. For young people with nowhere else to go, an arrest could make an already unstable life more dangerous. For anyone dressed in a way the police chose to challenge, the body itself became evidence. These raids taught people that public space was conditional. You could gather until power decided you had gathered too visibly. Still, bars were not only traps, they were also classrooms in recognition. A person might walk in frightened and leave with a sense of possibility. You could learn how to dress, how to flirt, where to find work, which officers were dangerous, which streets were safer, which doctors were cruel, which lawyers might help, which families had thrown someone out, which friend needed a couch. This knowledge did not arrive in official pamphlets. It moved through conversations. It moved through bartenders, older patrons, drag performers, street youth, activists, lovers, ex-lovers, and people who had survived enough to warn the newcomers. A hidden community has its own maps. They are rarely printed. They live in memory. By the mid-1960s, small acts of resistance were becoming more visible. Gay activists challenged policies that barred service in bars. They picketed government buildings. They argued against entrapment. They wrote letters and newsletters. In some places, people had already fought back physically against police harassment. Stonewall was not the first uprising, and it is important not to flatten the past by making it seem as if everyone was silent until one night in 1969. There had been resistance before, there had been courage before, there had been people who risked jobs, families, safety and reputations before. What Stonewall did was not create resistance from nothing. It gave a particular form of resistance a scale and visibility that could not be easily folded back into silence. The wider country was already tense. The civil rights movement had shown the power of protest and exposed the violence behind polite injustice. The women's movement was gathering force. The anti-war movement filled streets and campuses. Young people challenged authority in music, dress, sex and politics. Television carried images of conflict into living rooms. Cities had seen uprisings, marches, assassinations, police violence, grief and rage. By 1969, many Americans felt that the old order was cracking. Some feared that. Some welcomed it. For gay people, especially younger gay people, the question became harder to avoid. If other groups could march, why not us? If other people could name their oppression, why must we keep using whispers? If police could be challenged elsewhere, why should a raid on a gay bar remain a private shame instead of a public outrage? The answer was not obvious. Coming out could cost everything. Even the phrase coming out had not yet taken on all the public meaning it would later carry. For many, openness was not a simple moral choice. It was a practical danger. A person might support equality and still stay hidden because they had children, or a job, or a dependent parent, or no savings, or no safe place to go. This is something worth treating gently. It is easy, from the safety of later decades, to praise visibility and judge secrecy. But secrecy was often not cowardice. It was a strategy under pressure. People stayed hidden because the world punished those it could see. The fact that some came out anyway does not make those who could not less worthy of respect. So life before Stonewall was full of contradictions. Gay Americans were isolated and connected, hidden and visible, criminalized and organized, shamed and joyful, watched by police and held by one another. They lived inside fear, but fear was not the only thing in the room. There was humour, there was style, there was friendship, there was sex and romance and heartbreak and gossip and dancing and petty arguments and chosen family before that phrase became widely used. There were people who saved one another in small ways, with a phone number, a spare bed, a warning, a loan, a ride home, a lie told to protect someone. History often remembers movements through organisations and laws, but a community also survives through favours. Someone noticing that you did not come back from the bar and finding out where you were taken. Someone paying bail. Someone telling your landlord you'd been sick, not arrested. Someone helping you cut your hair or grow it out. Someone saying, very quietly, "I know a place you can go. That is the world standing behind the door of the Stonewall Inn." Not just oppression, though there was plenty of it. Not just bravery, though there was plenty of that too. A whole complicated life. People had spent years being told to lower their eyes, lower their voices, lower their expectations, lower the lights, lower the risk. They had built rooms in the dark because daylight had not welcomed them. They had learned to laugh where they were supposed to feel shame. They had learned the police routine so well that the first moments of another raid must have felt almost familiar. And that familiarity may have been part of what made the night so unbearable. Sometimes the thing that breaks people is not a new cruelty. It is the old cruelty arriving one more time, expecting the old response. By the summer of 1969, the Stonewall Inn was one of those imperfect shelters the city had produced. It existed because gay people needed places to gather, and because the respectable city refused to provide them. It existed because law, corruption, desire, fear, money, music, and loneliness had all found their way to the same address on Christopher Street. The people who walked through its door did not all agree with one another. They did not all use the same words for themselves. Some were political, some were not. Some wanted revolution. Some wanted a drink. Some wanted to dance. Some wanted to be left alone. But every person there understood something about the cost of being visible, and every person there lived in a country where that cost had been set deliberately high. The police who approached the Stonewall Inn in the early hours of June 28th were not stepping into an empty incident. They were stepping into accumulated history. They were stepping into the Lavender Scare, into bar raids, into medical labels, into lost jobs, into family rejections, into newspaper shaming, into street harassment, into every careful pronoun and every hidden photograph, and every dance interrupted by sudden light. They thought they were entering a bar. In a practical sense, they were. But in another sense, they were opening a door into years of pressure. And pressure, when it has nowhere safe to go, does not disappear. It waits. It settles into people's bodies. It becomes the joke that is a little too sharp, the glance that lasts a little too long, the crowd that does not move when ordered, the hand that throws the first coin before anyone has decided what the night is going to become. Before the door burst open, gay America was already alive. Hurt, watched, hidden, organised, mocked, desired, employed, fired, diagnosed, arrested, loved, and still alive. That is the fact that the police could never quite erase. The raids could empty a bar for one night, but they could not empty the need that filled it again. The laws could frighten people, but they could not make them stop finding one another. The doctors could name desire as sickness, but they could not make love vanish from the human body. The newspapers could print shame, but they could not prevent someone from reading between the lines and realizing they were not alone. By the time the officers reached the Stonewall Inn, the story was already crowded. The door was still closed, but behind it stood decades of silence, and silence is not the same thing as peace. The Stonewall Inn did not look like the kind of place that would one day become part of the official memory of the United States. It did not look like a monument. It did not look like the beginning of anything. If you had walked down Christopher Street in Greenwich Village in the late 1960s, you might have passed it without understanding what it meant to the people inside. The front of the building was plain enough. The windows were covered over, darkened so that the street could not easily look in. The entrance was controlled. The name did not announce itself with dignity. There was no clean historical plaque yet, no careful preservation, no visitors standing outside with phones, no school groups waiting for someone to explain why this address mattered. It was a bar, a rough bar, a crowded bar, a place with bad drinks, bad plumbing, a dangerous relationship with the police, and a reputation that made some people avoid it and others seek it out because there were not many other places left to go. It sat at 51 and 53 Christopher Street, in a neighbourhood that already had a long habit of collecting people who did not fit comfortably elsewhere. Greenwich Village was not safe in the simple way people sometimes imagine when they look backward and turn it into a bohemian postcard, but it did offer some looseness. It had artists, students, musicians, writers, political radicals, young people with little money, people arriving from other cities, people who had been told by their families or towns or churches that they were too much or not enough. In that environment, a gay bar could exist, not openly and securely, but with enough cover, enough bribery, enough people looking the other way at the right moments to keep the door opening night after night. The Stonewall Inn had once been a restaurant and nightclub, but by 1967 it had been remade into a gay bar under mafia control. That detail matters because it tells you something about what respectability refused to provide. If ordinary business owners had been able to operate safe, legal, well-kept gay bars without fear of losing licenses or being targeted by police, then gay customers would not have had to depend on criminal operators for a place to dance. But the city did not work that way. The public system treated gay gathering as a problem. The criminal system saw that problem and turned it into money. So a bar like the Stonewall existed inside a bargain that was ugly from every angle. The owners profited from people who had few alternatives. The police could raid when they chose or accept payments or do both. The patrons paid for watered-down drinks and unsafe conditions because, for a few hours at a time, the room gave them something the law would not. To enter, patrons often had to pass through the small rituals that made the place seem like a private club. This was part of the cover. A public bar needed a liquor license. A private bottle club could pretend that members brought their own liquor, even if that fiction did not match the reality inside. People might sign a book at the entrance, though the names written there were not always real. A false name in a book was a small shield. Not a strong one, not one that could survive serious pressure, but a shield all the same. It gave the appearance of membership while allowing the person entering to keep a little distance between their legal name and the room they were about to step into. That distance mattered. A name could travel. A name in police hands could become a name in a newspaper. A name in a newspaper could become a lost job, a furious parent, an ended marriage, an eviction, a life suddenly exposed before the person living it was ready. Imagine standing at that door for the first time. You're nervous, although you may be trying not to look nervous. You have heard about the place from someone who knew someone. Maybe you have walked past once or twice before but did not go in. The street itself feels public, and public space is not neutral for you. You have learned that the wrong glance can invite danger, and the wrong doorway can mark you. But tonight you step closer, someone checks you, someone decides whether you belong, or whether you look like trouble, or whether you might be police. Then the door gives way, and the city behind you changes. Inside, the Stonewall was not elegant. That needs to be said plainly because later memory can clean places up without meaning to. It was not a polished sanctuary. The conditions were poor. The drinks were cheap in quality and high in price. There were stories of glasses rinsed badly, if at all. There was little concern for the comfort or health of the people paying at the door. The people who ran the place were not running a charity. They were selling a few hours of permission to people who had been denied it elsewhere. That makes the Stonewall complicated. It was exploitative and necessary at the same time. It took advantage of its patrons and sheltered them. It was dangerous, corrupt, and beloved. Real places often are. They do not wait to become morally tidy before they become important. The lighting was low, partly for mood and partly for protection. Darkness did practical work in a place like this. It softened faces. It made quick recognition harder. It let people watch without being too visible themselves. The room would have smelled of alcohol, cigarette smoke, bodies in close quarters, city heat, and whatever had been spilled and not properly cleaned from the floor. The air was probably heavy on a busy night. A summer night in New York before modern expectations of clean indoor air was not a gentle thing. People smoked constantly. Fans pushed warm air around more than they cooled it. Bodies pressed close because space was limited. The sound was talk, laughter, glasses, footsteps, the door, the jukebox, and music trying to make the room larger than it was. The jukebox mattered. It is easy to overlook that kind of detail because it seems ordinary, a machine in the corner playing records. But music inside the Stonewall did something that music has often done for people under pressure. It gave the body permission to answer before the world could interrupt. A song could begin, and for a few minutes the rules loosened. Someone crossed the room, someone smiled, someone took a hand, someone stepped into a dance that would have been unsafe or impossible in many other places. The Stonewall was one of the few gay bars in New York where dancing was allowed, and that made it especially important. Dancing was not decoration. It was one of the reasons the room filled. There is something almost painfully simple about that. People came because they wanted to dance. Not because they had a theory of liberation, not because they knew a national monument would one day bear the name of the place, not because they had memorized legal arguments about equal protection, but because they were young or lonely or restless or in love or looking for love or tired of pretending. A dance floor can hold more meaning than it admits. To outsiders it may look like recreation. To the people on it, under the right circumstances, it can be the only place in the city where the body is not lying. A man dancing with a man in that room was not merely moving to music. He was crossing a line that the outside world had drawn around him. A woman watching another woman from across the room could do so with less fear than she might feel on a subway platform or in a workplace cafeteria. A drag queen could claim attention in a way that turned the stare back on itself. A young person who had been sleeping wherever they could might stand near the wall and understand that nobody inside was living the easy version of life either. The place did not erase danger, but it redistributed it. Outside, a person might be alone with the risk. Inside, the risk was shared. The crowd at the Stonewall was mixed in ways that made some people love it and others look down on it. There were gay men, there were lesbians, there were drag queens, there were gender non-conforming people, there were street youth, there were people with jobs and apartments and people with neither. There were black and Latino patrons, white patrons, older patrons, very young patrons, people who wanted to disappear into the corners, and people who could not have disappeared if they tried. Some gay bars of the era were more selective, more controlled, more interested in a narrow kind of respectability. The Stonewall was rougher and more open to people who did not fit even within the safer layers of gay social life. That roughness was part of its importance. A person who might be turned away elsewhere could sometimes get inside here. This did not mean everyone inside was equal. No room in America in 1969 escaped race, class, gender, money, or status. Those divisions came through the door with everyone else. A white middle-class gay man with a stable job faced real danger, but not the same danger as a homeless queer teenager of colour sleeping near the park. A lesbian dressed in a way police considered masculine might be targeted differently than someone who could pass more easily through a straight office by day. A drag queen might bring life and style into the room, while also carrying some of the highest risk if officers decided to make arrests. The Stonewall gathered people under one roof, but it did not make their lives identical. History becomes more honest when we remember that shared oppression does not erase difference. It only places different people under related pressures. Near the bar or along the walls, people watched carefully even while they laughed. That was one of the skills of the time. You could enjoy yourself, but some part of you remained alert. You watched the door. You noticed changes in the lights. You kept track of who entered. You knew that undercover officers could appear friendly until they were not. You knew that a raid could interrupt everything. You knew that people in charge might get advance warning because money had passed through the right hands, but you also knew that bribery was not protection you could trust. It was only another unstable arrangement between people who had power over you. When raids happened, there was often a pattern. The lights came on. The music stopped. People moved apart. Identification was checked. Employees might be arrested. Patrons might be lined up. Those whose clothing did not match the expectations of police could be subjected to special attention. The cash register and alcohol might be seized. The door might be padlocked. Sometimes people were taken away. Sometimes they were humiliated and released. Even when an arrest did not lead to serious legal consequences, the threat of exposure could be severe enough. Shame was one of the police department's tools, and it was sharpened by the society around it. That is what makes the ordinary moments inside the Stonewall feel so charged. Every laugh had a police station somewhere behind it. Every dance had the possibility of interruption. Every flirtation had to exist inside the knowledge that the room could change without warning. And still people laughed. Still they danced. Still someone fed coins into the jukebox. Still a young person came in from the street because the alternative was wandering outside alone. Still, people returned after raids because the need did not go away just because the police had noticed it. If you have never needed a hidden room, it may be hard to understand the loyalty people can feel toward a place that treats them badly. But think of it this way. A shelter during a storm does not have to be well built for you to remember it with gratitude. If the roof leaks, you may complain about the leak. If the floor is dirty, you may hate the floor. If the owner overcharges you, you may know perfectly well that you're being used. But if outside that door the storm is waiting, you do not confuse the shelter with freedom. You only understand that it is better than standing alone in the rain. The Stonewall was like that for many of the people who entered it. Not freedom, not safety, a shelter, a rough little shelter in the dark. There was also pleasure there, and that needs to stay in the story. Histories of persecuted people often become so focused on the persecution that they accidentally remove the joy. The people inside Stonewall were not only victims in waiting, they were alive. They had favourite songs, they had crushes, they had arguments, they noticed who looked good, who had arrived with whom, who had been absent too long, who was drunk too early, who was telling the same story again. Someone was probably heartbroken in the corner. Someone else was starting a romance that would last 3 weeks or 30 years. Someone had borrowed money to get in. Someone had come after work and was trying to shake off the day. Someone had nowhere to go afterward and was stretching the night as long as possible because morning would bring the same problems back. The room gave people roles they might not get elsewhere. A shy person could become known. A young person could be taught how to move through the city. A drag performer could become a local figure. An older patron could become a guide, a warning, a cautionary tale, or a source of small kindness. The bar was social infrastructure, even if nobody used that phrase. It connected people. It spread information. It taught survival. It gave names to faces and faces to possibilities. In a time when many gay Americans could not safely gather in public organizations, the bar became one of the places where community happened, because there were simply not enough other rooms. Think about the first time someone realized they were not alone. That moment may not have happened in a political meeting. It may not have happened in a library. It may have happened in a place like Stonewall, while pushing through a crowd and seeing in one glance more people like themselves than they had ever seen before. Not exactly like themselves, of course. No one is exactly like anyone, but close enough. Close enough to break the old belief that they were singular, strange, isolated beyond repair. That realization can be quiet, but it is not small. A person who knows they are not alone becomes harder to convince that they deserve nothing. The Stonewall Inn also existed beside Christopher Park, and the street outside was part of its world. People gathered there before going in, after leaving, or when they could not afford to enter. Street youth moved through the area. Some were gay, some trans or gender non-conforming. some simply rejected by families and systems that had no patience for them. They were visible in a way more protected people were not. Their lives were often unstable, improvised, and exposed to police attention. They knew the sidewalks, the shadows, the corners, the habits of officers, the rhythms of late-night village life. When the uprising began, the crowd outside would matter. The people who did not simply go home would matter. The street was not separate from the bar. It was the bar's outer room. On an ordinary night, the movement between inside and outside probably felt natural. Someone stepped out for air. Someone arrived and hesitated. Someone leaned against a wall. Someone watched the door. Someone laughed too loudly. Someone warned someone else about police nearby. The Stonewall was not only the physical space behind the entrance. It was the cluster of people drawn to it, the knowledge attached to it, the expectation that something might happen there because things always might happen there. A bar like that was never only a business. It was a habit in the life of a neighbourhood. Inside, the management had its own systems for dealing with danger. If police were expected, lights could be raised as a warning. Patrons knew to stop touching, stop dancing, look less vulnerable to arrest if they could. That warning system tells you how routine the threat had become. A whole room of people could shift behaviour in response to light. One moment the room was music and bodies. The next it was posture, distance, calculation. People had to become actors in the version of themselves the law demanded. Then, when the threat passed, the room might slowly return to itself. The music resumed. People moved closer again. The night recovered, but not completely. A room that has had to save itself once remains aware that it may have to do so again. I want to sit with that for a moment because there is a particular kind of damage in repeated interruption. One raid may frighten you. Repeated raids train you. They train your shoulders to tighten when the door opens too quickly. They train your joy to keep one eye open. They train your body to know that pleasure can be evidence. They make you practice disappearance until disappearance begins to feel like a normal social skill. Then people outside look at your caution and call it secrecy, as if secrecy were a preference rather than a scar. The Stonewall's customers lived inside that training. Some had more practice than others. Older patrons had seen bars closed, friends arrested, jobs lost. Younger patrons may have carried more impatience, less willingness to accept the old routine, or simply less to lose. That difference between generations mattered in the late 1960s. Early homophile activists had often emphasized order, respectability, and careful persuasion. Younger people coming of age amid civil rights marches, anti-war protests, women's liberation, and street confrontation had seen other ways of responding to power. Not everyone inside the Stonewall was political, but the air outside was political whether people asked for it or not. America in 1969 was not calm. A police raid in that year did not land in the same national mood as it might have 15 years earlier. Even so, most people at the Stonewall that night probably expected the usual. That is part of what makes the story powerful. The people inside were not gathered for a planned rebellion. They were gathered for a night out. The fact that history entered through the door does not change what they had come there for. They came for company, for music, for a drink, for dancing, for sex, for friendship, for distraction, for the simple relief of being in a room where the performance of straightness could be set down for a while. Then the city reached in to take even that. Before the raid, before the police line, before the crowd outside swelled into something officers could not easily control, the Stonewall Inn was carrying all of these meanings at once. It was a bad bar and a needed bar, a business run through corruption and a home of sorts for people who had been denied better homes, a place of exploitation and a place of recognition, a room where people were overcharged and underprotected, yet still found enough life to keep returning. That contradiction is not a problem to solve. It is the reality to understand. There is a reason places matter in history. Laws are written in offices, court decisions are printed on paper, speeches are delivered from platforms, but people live in rooms. They remember doorways, corners, smells, songs, tables, the angle of a light, the face of someone who looked at them kindly when they expected contempt. The Stonewall became important not because the building itself was noble, but because people had poured need into it. They had made it mean something through repetition. Night after night, body after body, song after song, risk after risk, the room became charged with the fact of return. They came back because they needed what it gave them, even when what it gave was incomplete. Late on June 27th, 1969, and into the early hours of June 28th, the Stonewall was crowded. It was a Friday night turning into Saturday morning, one of the busiest times for a bar. The city outside was still awake in the way New York stays awake, not all at once, but in layers. Taxis moving, sidewalk conversations. Cigarette smoke near doorways, people leaving one place and looking for another. Inside the Stonewall, the night had its own rhythm. Music, heat, talk, watching, laughter, drinking, dancing, the door opening, the door closing, the fragile sense that for now the room belonged to the people in it. That phrase, for now, is doing a great deal of work. Every refuge under pressure has a for now inside it. For now, the police are not here. For now, the song is still playing. For now, your hand is in someone else's hand. For now, nobody has said your name in the wrong tone. For now, the street remains outside. For now, you can be part of a crowd without being alone. The people inside the Stonewall understood, even if they did not say it in these words, that the night could change quickly. They had lived with that knowledge long enough for it to become ordinary. Then came the raid. Not yet the uprising, not yet the crowd pushing back, not yet the images that would gather around the name Stonewall later. First, just the raid. The old pattern arriving again. Police at the door, authority entering the room, the music stopping or being stopped. The lights shifting, bodies separating. People turning toward the interruption with that tired, practiced fear that comes when humiliation has become familiar. The officers thought they knew what kind of night this would be, because they had seen nights like it before. The patrons thought they knew too, at least at first. Identification would be checked. Some people would be singled out. The bar would be handled as a problem. The people inside would be treated as evidence of that problem. But a place is not only walls, and a crowd is not only bodies. A place can hold years of pressure. A crowd can hold more anger than it shows. Inside the Stonewall Inn, on that humid night at the end of June, the rough little shelter in the dark was about to be exposed to the street. The door that had separated the hidden room from the public city was about to open in the worst possible way. And when people were pushed out into the night, they would not all do what they had done before. The raid began in the early morning hours of June 28th, 1969, at the hour when a city is not asleep exactly, but no longer fully awake in the daylight sense either. It was sometime around 1:15 or 1:20 in the morning, late enough that the people inside the Stonewall Inn had already crossed from Friday night into Saturday, without thinking much about the calendar. Late enough that anyone still out had chosen the night over the ordinary demands of morning. The jukebox was working. The rooms were crowded. The air inside was warm and thick. People were drinking, talking, watching one another, and dancing in the half-darkness of a bar that was unsafe in many ways, but still safer than most of the world outside. Then the police came in, and the old pattern started again. At first, it must have felt familiar. That is one of the details that matters most. The police raid did not arrive as something unimaginable. It arrived as something people already knew how to fear. Gay bars in New York were used to being raided. Patrons were used to sudden interruption. They were used to lights coming up, music stopping, bodies separating, faces changing. They were used to the quick shift from private life to public exposure. One moment you're leaning close to someone because the room is loud. The next moment you're standing apart from them because closeness can be used against you. One moment a song is covering the room. The next moment silence has entered with uniforms and questions. If you had lived through enough of these raids, your body probably knew what to do before your mind had time to form a sentence. This was part of the humiliation. It was not only the possibility of arrest, though that was real, it was the training. It was the way police power had taught people to drop their hands, straighten their clothes, hide their fear, check their pockets for identification, and prepare to be handled. It was the way a room that had taken hours to become alive could be stripped of that life in seconds. The Stonewall Inn was already an imperfect refuge, run through corruption, watched by police, and open only because a crooked arrangement had made it possible. But for the people inside, it was still a room where they could exist with less editing than they had to perform elsewhere. A raid turned that room against them. It took the very place where they had gone to be less afraid, and filled it with the thing they had been afraid of. The officers who entered that night were led by Deputy Inspector Seymour Pine of the New York Police Department. They had a warrant connected to the illegal sale of alcohol. On paper, that was the reason. The Stonewall Inn was not operating as a proper licensed bar, and that gave the police a legal path through the door. But everyone in the room understood that liquor was only part of the story. The city had many illegalities when it chose not to notice them. The law did not descend with equal force on every bad drink, every unlicensed arrangement, every payoff, every filthy glass, every backroom deal. The Stonewall was targeted because it was a gay bar. The alcohol charge gave the raid a clean administrative face. Beneath that face was the old message: you are allowed to gather only until we decide to remind you that you are not. Think about the officers stepping inside, the first sweep of authority through the room, the command in their voices. The likely confusion near the entrance as people tried to understand whether this was a warning, a routine inspection, or something more serious. In many raids, owners or managers might receive advance notice through bribery or police connections, enough time to hide liquor or prepare the room. But this raid did not unfold neatly. It came with a warrant. It came late. It came when the bar was crowded. It came at a moment when the police expected compliance and the patrons expected indignity, which had usually been the same thing. The lights came up. The music stopped. That change alone would have felt violent in its own quiet way. Not violence in the sense of fists or batons yet, but the violence of exposure. Low light had protected the room. Music had held it together. Darkness and sound had made a small world inside the larger hostile city. When the lights rose and the jukebox went silent, the Stonewall became smaller. Every face became easier to read. Every outfit became easier to judge. Every gesture became evidence waiting for interpretation. A bar built on the fragile permission of darkness was suddenly bright enough for humiliation. People were told to line up. Identification was checked. Employees were arrested for selling alcohol without a license. Patrons waited while police sorted them into categories that made sense to police. Who worked there? Who had identification? Who was dressed in a way the officers chose to challenge? Who could be released? Who would be taken in? This is what a raid does. It reduces a room full of human beings into a set of problems to be processed. A person who had arrived as a friend, a lover, a dancer, a regular, a stranger looking for a place to stand became an ID card, a name, a body, an arrest risk, a possible newspaper item. For many, the fear of being named was as heavy as the fear of being taken away. A person could survive the night physically and still lose the life waiting for them in daylight. If a name appeared in print, if a boss heard, if a family was called, if a spouse learned, if a landlord decided trouble had moved into the building, the consequences could keep unfolding long after the police van left Christopher Street. That is why the line inside the Stonewall was not merely a line. It was a thin place between one life and another. On one side stood the life you'd arranged carefully enough to keep. On the other side stood the possibility that someone with a badge could pull it apart by writing your name in the wrong place. Accounts of raids in this period often describe special scrutiny directed at people whose clothing did not match what police expected from their assigned sex. The common memory of the era includes the so-called rule about wearing 3 articles of gender-appropriate clothing, and whether that rule existed exactly as remembered, or was enforced through broader disorderly conduct laws, the practical reality was clear enough. Police had ways to punish gender nonconformity. They had ways to turn a dress, a suit, a pair of shoes, a haircut, a manner, a body into a reason for attention. During raids, people could be separated and inspected. The insult of that kind of treatment is hard to overstate. It was not only arrest, it was the state claiming the right to decide whether your body and your clothes were acceptable, and then making that decision in public. Imagine being one of the people singled out that night. The room is bright now. Everyone knows something is happening to you. Maybe you are ordered aside. Maybe an officer looks you up and down. Maybe your clothes, which felt like relief when you put them on, become evidence in someone else's mouth. Maybe you have been through this before and know that fear can make the face hard, so you make yours harder. Maybe you joke. Maybe you go quiet. Maybe you're so tired of this exact humiliation that you feel something colder than panic. Not courage yet, not a plan, just the end of patience beginning to form inside the body. The Stonewall's patrons were not all treated the same. Those with identification who looked, to police, easier to categorise might have expected to be released after the first wave of checking. Those without identification, those who worked at the bar, those dressed in ways officers targeted, and those the police chose to make examples of were at greater risk. That unequal danger mattered. Every raid exposed differences that existed even within the community. Some people could move through the system with less damage. Others carried the full force of the raid on their bodies. A middle-class patron who feared exposure might be terrified of a newspaper listing. A homeless teenager might be worried about where they would sleep after release. A drag queen might face the direct insult of being treated as a spectacle by officers. A lesbian who resisted police handling might be punished not only for being gay, but for refusing the particular obedience expected of women. The raid gathered everyone into one crisis, but the crisis did not press on everyone in exactly the same way. Outside, the street began to change. This is where the usual pattern started to bend. During many raids, patrons who were released or bystanders who gathered nearby would eventually drift away. They might wait anxiously for friends, complain, watch, perhaps mutter insults. But the police expected the crowd to remain manageable. That expectation was part of the routine. Officers were accustomed to gay bar patrons being frightened, embarrassed, and eager to disappear before too much damage could be done to their public lives. Shame helped clear the street. Fear helped clear the street. The hour helped clear the street. People had jobs, homes, families, secrets. The safest thing to do was usually to leave. This time, people did not leave quickly enough. Some were pushed out of the bar after being checked. Some had been outside already. Some came closer because the sight of a police raid at the Stonewall drew attention in a neighbourhood where the Stonewall was not just another doorway. Word moved fast on Christopher Street. People saw the police wagons. People saw patrons coming out. People understood what was happening. A crowd gathered. Not instantly as a riot. Not yet as unified force, but as a loose collection of watchers, friends, neighbours, street youth, regulars, curious people, angry people, people who wanted to know who had been taken, and people who had seen this too many times before. The police had opened the bar. Now the street was watching the police. There is a difference between being humiliated in private and being humiliated before a crowd that understands the humiliation. Inside the bar, the police controlled the room. Outside, their control was less certain. The patrons who emerged did not enter an empty sidewalk. They entered a public witness. That changed the emotional temperature of the night. Someone coming out of the bar after being checked might normally hurry away, head down, trying to reduce the size of the incident. But if friends are waiting, if the street is full, if laughter and anger begin to move through the crowd, shame has less room to work. A person who might have felt alone in humiliation can look up and see that the humiliation is shared. Shared humiliation can become anger very quickly. The early mood outside has been described in different ways by people who were there, and by those who studied the accounts later. That is worth remembering because spontaneous events rarely leave behind one clean version. Some recalled campy humour at first, the kind of sharp public joking that can puncture authority. Some remembered people posing, calling out, making fun of the officers. Some remembered tension from the beginning. A raid could produce all of that at once. Humour and fear are not opposites in a crowd like this. They can live side by side. A joke thrown at police can be a joke, a shield, and a threat, all at the same time. Laughter can say, "You do not own the meaning of this moment." The police began bringing people out, employees, patrons under arrest. People selected from the line. They were moved toward waiting vehicles. That movement from doorway to wagon was the narrow stage on which the night began to change shape. The bar itself had been hidden, or at least shielded. The raid made its people visible. The sidewalk became a theatre of exposure, and every person forced into a vehicle made the crowd larger in feeling, even if not yet in number. Watching someone you recognise being pushed into police custody is different from hearing abstractly that raids happen. It is immediate. It asks something of you, even if you do not know how to answer. For the officers, this may still have looked like a difficult but ordinary operation. Process the bar, arrest the employees, confiscate what needed to be confiscated, load the people being taken in, clear the street, wait for transport, write the reports, another raid, another night's work. But the timing was not helping them. The paddy wagons did not remove everyone instantly. The crowd had time to grow. The longer people stood outside, the more the raid became a public event rather than a private police action. Every delay gave anger time to find company. There is something important in that waiting. Many uprisings begin not in the first blow, but in the minutes before it, when people are close enough to feel one another's mood changing. A crowd is not just a number of bodies. It is a communication system. It notices itself. One person calls out and 10 people laugh. One person refuses to move and 5 people realise they have not moved either. Someone says something that would have sounded foolish alone, but in a crowd becomes permission. Someone at the back cannot see clearly but can feel the front reacting. The police may still be giving orders, but the emotional authority of the scene begins to shift. The question becomes not simply what the officers will do, but what the crowd will allow to be done in front of them. Inside the Stonewall, the officers still had work to finish. The bar had to be searched, liquor had to be seized, money had to be handled, people had to be moved. The place that had been loud and alive a short time before was now being turned into evidence. Drawers, bottles, cash, papers, bodies, names. A raid has a way of making even furniture seem accused. The physical bar, already dirty and damaged, became a site of official sorting. The room where people had danced was now a workplace for police. That transformation must have felt bitter to anyone still inside watching it happen. The room had not been clean, but it had been theirs for the night. Now even that small claim had been interrupted. The first people released from the bar may have had a choice, at least in theory. Leave or stay. Go home or remain nearby. Protect yourself or watch what happens to the others. There is no shame in leaving. It is important to say that. People had real reasons to protect themselves. Not everyone could afford arrest. Not everyone could risk being seen. Not everyone had the same physical safety, the same legal vulnerability, the same support system waiting. Some people surely left because leaving was how they survived. History often remembers the ones who stayed, but it should not despise the ones who went. Fear is not a moral failure when the danger is real. Still, enough stayed. That is the hinge. Enough people stayed that the police could not easily convert the raid into silence. Enough stayed that those being arrested were not simply disappearing into the machinery of the city. Enough stayed that the officers could hear the crowd. Enough stayed that people arriving from nearby streets could see there was something worth joining. The raid had produced an audience, and the audience was becoming less passive by the minute. A patrol wagon at the curb can look ordinary if you do not know who is being put inside it. For the people on Christopher Street, it did not look ordinary. It looked like the old system doing its old work, only this time in front of too many witnesses who knew exactly what that work meant. The crowd began to react, not yet with the full force that would come. At first there were comments, jokes, calls, insults. People mocked the police. Some treated the forced exit from the bar as if it were a performance, applauding patrons as they emerged, turning shame into theatre. That was not trivial. Mockery can be a weapon when a system depends on making you lower your head. To cheer someone coming out of a raid is to say they have not made you small. To laugh at officers in that moment is to loosen the obedience they expected. The police were not used to that response from this kind of crowd. They were used to fear. They were used to embarrassment. They were used to people trying to protect their names by vanishing. They were used to the power of shame doing half their work. But the people outside Stonewall were beginning to discover that shame did not function the same way when it was refused collectively. One person alone might be crushed by exposure. A crowd can sometimes turn exposure into defiance. It does not always happen, and it cannot be ordered into being. But when it happens, authority can feel it before it fully understands it. Some of the most remembered accounts of the night centre on a person being forced toward a police vehicle and resisting, often identified in later memory as a butch lesbian, though accounts differ on exact identity. What matters for this moment is not the simplicity of a single heroic trigger, because history is rarely that clean. What matters is that the crowd saw resistance under police handling, and the sight struck something already waiting. A person struggling not to be shoved quietly into a patrol car became, for those watching, a visible form of the anger they had carried privately for years. The cry of police brutality rose because the crowd recognised what it was seeing. It was not an isolated rough handling. It was the familiar violence of the system made physical in front of them. The night had not yet become the uprising people would later name. It was still forming. The old humiliation was still present. The raid was still the raid. Police still had the weapons, the vehicles, the authority of the city behind them. The patrons and onlookers still had plenty of reasons to be afraid. But the emotional shape of the scene had changed. Inside the bar, people had been lined up and checked as usual. Outside, they were no longer dissolving as usual. The usual script required shame, dispersal, and quiet. One by one, those elements were beginning to fail. It is worth staying in that uncertain moment instead of rushing past it. The most famous parts of Stonewall are loud. Coins thrown, bottles breaking, police retreating. Flames, reinforcements, chants, people filling the streets. Those moments matter, and we will get to them. But just before the first objects flew, there was this slower, stranger transformation. A raid that had been designed to isolate people began gathering them. A process meant to humiliate began producing witness. A crowd that police expected to control through fear discovered that it was, in fact, a crowd. The difference sounds small until you think about it carefully. An individual can be processed. A line can be managed. A crowd that knows why it is angry becomes something else. The door of the Stonewall Inn had opened, and the hidden room had spilled into the public street. That alone was dangerous. The private shelter was exposed. Names could be remembered. Faces could be seen. The careful distance people kept between their daytime lives and their nighttime survival was collapsing under the lights of police cars and the attention of strangers. But exposure did not produce only terror. It also produced recognition. People saw one another standing there. They saw who had not gone home. They saw anger on faces that had often been forced into jokes or silence. They saw the police doing what police had done before, and they saw, perhaps with surprise, that the street was not emptying. A person in that crowd could not know what the next few hours would become. No one could. No one standing on Christopher Street just then could see the future marches, the organisations, the anniversaries, the arguments over memory, the monument, the the textbooks, the way the word Stonewall would travel around the world. They could only see the door, the officers, the people being led out, the vehicles waiting, the familiar insult taking place one more time. History, in the moment it is lived, rarely announces its size. It arrives as a practical decision. Stay or leave. Speak or stay quiet. Laugh or lower your head. Move back when ordered, or remain where you are. The raid began as a reminder of power. It continued as a test of whether that power would be accepted in the usual way. For a little while, the answer was still unclear. The police were still moving people. The crowd was still watching. The first sharp sounds of refusal were beginning to rise from the sidewalk. Something had shifted, but not enough for anyone to name it yet. The old humiliation had entered the room expecting obedience, and now, outside under the warm night air of Christopher Street, it was meeting people who had begun to understand that obedience was no longer guaranteed. The first push back did not begin as a single clean moment. It did not arrive with a leader stepping forward, raising one hand and giving everyone a sentence to remember. That is usually how people want history to happen, because it makes the story easier to carry. One brave person, one first brick, one perfect line. 1 second when fear becomes courage. But Christopher Street in the early hours of June 28th, 1969 was not neat like that. It was crowded, confused, loud in uneven waves, and full of people who did not yet know whether they were watching another raid or the beginning of something that would change the language of American protest. The first push back came in pieces. A laugh, a shout, a coin. A body that did not move when told. A person being shoved too hard. A crowd that had every reason to scatter and did not. For a little while, the police still had the shape of the night in their hands. They had entered the Stonewall Inn. They had stopped the music. They had turned the lights on. They had lined people up, checked identification, separated those they intended to arrest, and moved through the bar with the tired confidence of officers doing something they had done before. The routine was cruel, but it was still routine. That was what made it useful to them. A routine teaches everyone where to stand. It teaches one side how to command and the other how to survive. If the patrons followed the old pattern, the night would shrink back into the familiar story. Some people would be taken away, some would hurry home, some would spend the next day afraid their names would appear somewhere. The Stonewall would be another entry in a long list of raids, another humiliation absorbed into the private lives of people who had already absorbed too much. Outside, that pattern began to fail. The people who were released from the bar did not all disappear into the village streets. They came out into the warm night and stayed near the doorway. Some waited for friends. Some wanted to see who else would be brought out. Some were angry and did not feel like walking away just because walking away had been the safer choice every other time. Others had not been inside the bar at all. They were neighbours, visitors, young people from Christopher Park, people who saw police vehicles and a crowd and moved toward it, because New York teaches people to notice commotion. Within minutes, the sidewalk was no longer only a sidewalk. It had become an audience. That audience mattered. Police raids depended partly on isolation. A person humiliated alone is easier to control. A person pushed into a wagon while strangers watch in silence is still alone in a public way. But a person pushed into a wagon while a crowd jeers at the police, cheers the arrested and refuses to turn embarrassment into shame is not alone in the same way. The meaning of the scene changes. The police may still have the handcuffs, the vehicles, the badges, and the legal authority of the city, but the crowd has begun taking control of what the moment feels like. That is not a small thing. Power cares about feeling more than it admits. Some of the first responses were not violent, they were theatrical. People coming out of the bar posed for the crowd. They saluted in exaggerated ways. They treated the forced exit like an unwanted performance, and then made the performance their own. The crowd applauded. That detail can sound almost funny if you hear it too quickly. A police raid. and people clapping. But that applause had weight. It turned exposure into recognition. It said, "We see you, and we are not ashamed of you." It said, "They may have forced you into the light, but they do not get to decide what that light means." The police had expected the light to shame people. The crowd used it to make them visible in another way. This is one of the reasons Stonewall still feels alive when you read the accounts. The early mood was not simple rage. It included humour, camp, sarcasm, street performance, mockery, and a kind of high nervous energy that belonged to people who were scared and enjoying, for a dangerous moment, the sight of officers being laughed at. A joke in a situation like that is not only a joke, it is a test. Can we say this out loud? Can we laugh at them and not be punished immediately? Can the thing that usually makes us lower our heads be made ridiculous instead? Every laugh that survived made the next one easier. Then the wagons came and the night tightened. Police began moving people toward the vehicles. Employees were loaded in. People connected to the bar were taken. Some in the crowd cheered, not because they wanted anyone arrested, but because cheering was a way to keep the arrested from being swallowed quietly. The officers had to perform their work in front of people who understood the insult. That made the work harder. The crowd was not watching like neutral citizens watching disorder be controlled. Many of them had been controlled the same way. Many had been raided before, arrested before, touched roughly before, mocked before, threatened before. They knew what it meant when the police called this procedure. They knew what procedure felt like on the body. Someone shouted, "Gay power." The phrase did not yet have the settled familiarity it would gain later. It sounded new because public gay defiance was still new to many ears. There had been organisations before, careful protests before, picket lines before, brave letters and meetings and lawsuits before. But gay power shouted outside a raided bar in the early morning was a different kind of sentence. It did not ask politely to be considered. It did not argue that homosexuals were respectable citizens if only the public would study the facts. It was not dressed in a suit for a government building. It came from the street. It came from bodies watching other bodies handled by police. It came from anger with no interest in sounding grateful. A few people sang or tried to sing lines from protest songs that had moved through the wider culture of the 1960s. That too mattered. The people on Christopher Street were not sealed away from the rest of American life. They had seen civil rights marches. They had seen anti-war protests. They had seen students face police. They had seen language like power and liberation move from one struggle into another. Not everyone outside the Stonewall was an activist. Some were drunk, some were tired, some were frightened, some were simply curious. But the political air of 1969 had reached them whether they wanted it or not. When a crowd already angry hears a phrase that makes its anger sound public, the phrase can travel fast. The police still tried to keep the old order of the raid. People were moved. Commands were given. The crowd was told, in one way or another, to clear. But the people outside had begun answering. They called out insults. They mocked the officers. They watched every shove. They reacted when someone was handled roughly. The officers, used to dispersal, now had to manage an audience that was growing more hostile because it could see too much. A raid that might have stayed inside a dark bar had spilled into the public street, and the public street was not behaving. Coins began to fly. Pennies, nickels, dimes, whatever people had in their pockets. The act had a sharp meaning. The Stonewall existed inside a system of payoffs. Police corruption and bar corruption had shaped the place from the beginning. Money moved between those who ran illegal bars and those who could decide how hard the law would come down. So when people threw coins, they were not only throwing small objects, they were throwing the language of bribery back at the police. There are accounts of someone shouting about paying them off, and then the coins came. Imagine the sound of them hitting pavement, metal, glass, the side of a vehicle, the street around the officer's feet. Small sounds, but many of them. Small objects, but pointed by meaning. It was mock payment. It said, "Is this what you came for?" It said, "Here is your money." It said, "We know how this works." That gesture was not enough to drive police back by itself, but it marked a change. A crowd throwing coins is no longer only watching. The line between witness and participant has been crossed. For some people, that first thrown coin may have looked almost childish, a taunt. For the officers, it was a warning. The crowd had discovered the use of its hands. Beer bottles followed. Cans, too. Objects that were already part of the night became weapons of refusal. A bottle on a bar is ordinary. A bottle thrown at police during a raid becomes a message nobody can ignore. This does not mean everyone threw something. Most people in any crowd do not. Many shouted, many watched, many moved with the group. Some may have wanted to stop things from escalating. Some may have stepped back and then forward again. Crowds are not single creatures, no matter how they look from a distance. But enough objects were thrown that the police could no longer pretend the scene was under ordinary control. Rumours moved through the street. This always happens when people cannot see everything. Someone said patrons were being beaten inside. Someone said the police were hurting people. Someone saw a shove and repeated it as something worse. Someone heard a cry and filled in what they could not see. Rumour is often treated as unreliable, and it is. But in a moment like this, it also reveals what people already believe is possible. The crowd believed police violence was possible because they had seen it before. They believed people inside could be beaten because people like them had been beaten before. Whether every rumour was accurate in every detail mattered less in that moment than the fact that the crowd trusted the idea of police cruelty more than it trusted police restraint. Then came the struggle around a person being taken to a wagon, remembered in many accounts as a butch lesbian in handcuffs. The exact identity has been argued over, and it is better not to force a simple answer where the historical record remains contested. Some people later associated the moment with Stormy de Larverie, who was a biracial lesbian performer and community figure, though accounts differ. What matters here is what the crowd saw and how it responded. A handcuffed person resisted. Officers struggled with her. She escaped their grip more than once or fought against being placed in the vehicle. She was handled roughly. She called out to the crowd, by many accounts asking why they did not do something. That question, whether remembered word for word or carried by the memory of the moment, struck the street like a match. Why don't you do something? It was not a speech. It was not a plan. It was a demand thrown at people who were already asking themselves the same thing without saying it. The crowd had been joking, shouting, throwing coins, throwing bottles, watching, waiting. Now the question became physical. Are you going to stand here and watch this happen again? Are you going to let the wagon take one more person? Are you going to go home and tell yourself you were lucky it was not you? There are moments when a question does not need an answer, because the answer becomes movement. The crowd surged, not like a trained unit, not like an army, but like people suddenly pushing through the last layer of restraint. The police tried to push back. Some people in handcuffs escaped or were pulled away. The vehicles became targets. People rocked a wagon or tried to overturn it. Tyres were slashed. The officers, realising the crowd was larger and angrier than the number of police could safely manage, began to lose the street. That must have been a strange and frightening moment for them. Police were accustomed to entering gay bars as the force that ended the night. Now the night was not ending. It was expanding around them. The numbers outside kept growing. A crowd attracts a crowd in a city, especially at that hour in that neighbourhood. People came from nearby bars. People leaned out windows or stepped down from apartments. People who had been walking elsewhere stopped because the noise pulled them in. Some understood the politics immediately. Others understood only that police were in trouble and a crowd was forming. But once there, they were part of the pressure. 5 people shouting can be ignored. 50 can be threatened. 500 becomes a different problem. The police were outnumbered, and more importantly, they were outnumbered by people who were no longer behaving as expected. There is a detail from the accounts that deserves to be felt slowly. The police retreated into the Stonewall Inn. The direction had reversed. At the beginning of the raid, police had entered the bar to control the patrons. Now police were moving back into the same bar to protect themselves from the crowd outside. The doorway changed meaning in less than an hour. It had been the point where authority entered. Then it became the point where patrons were forced out. Then it became a barricade behind which officers hid. History rarely offers images that clear. The rough little shelter of gay nightlife the place police had invaded became the place police needed for cover. The crowd did not treat the retreat as the end of the matter. If anything, it intensified the scene. People attacked the building. Objects hit the windows and facade. Trash cans were thrown. Bricks or stones from nearby construction areas were used by some in the crowd. A parking meter was pulled from the ground and used as a battering ram against the door. Burning trash was pushed toward the building. There were people still inside with the police, including some who had been arrested or detained, and the danger was real. This was not symbolic protest in a clean open square. It was a close, chaotic street confrontation with frightened people on both sides of a door that might not hold. That is part of why this event cannot be turned into something sentimental without losing the truth. Stonewall was not gentle. It was not polite. It was not safe. It was not a candlelight vigil or a formal march with instructions printed ahead of time. It was a street fight born out of accumulated humiliation. That does not make it meaningless. It makes it historical. People often want the oppressed to resist in ways that are easy to admire from a distance. Quietly, patiently, beautifully, with no broken glass and no inconvenience. But the people asking for that are often people who have never had their only dance floor raided by police. Stonewall asks a harder question. What does dignity look like when every respectable path to dignity has been blocked? Inside the bar, the officers and those trapped with them must have felt the building shake under the force outside. The windows broke. The door took blows. The street was loud with shouts, anger, sirens, and impact. Police called for reinforcements. The tactical patrol force, a riot control unit, would come later, bringing helmets, batons, and a more organised force into the village streets. But before that larger confrontation arrived, there was this strange trapped interval when the police who had come to conduct the raid were barricaded inside the very bar they had meant to empty, and the crowd outside seemed to grow bolder with every minute that the officers did not regain control. People shouted insults at the police. Some shouted words that had been used against gay people and turned them outward, twisting the language of contempt until it no longer belonged only to the people who had suffered under it. That kind of reversal is common in uprisings, because language is one of the first tools power uses and one of the first tools people seize back. A slur in the mouth of an officer is meant to reduce. A slur thrown back by the crowd can become mockery, anger, or ownership for one dangerous second. None of this was tidy. It was raw street language, the vocabulary of people who were not trying to impress a committee. They were trying to make police retreat. The crowd included people who mainstream society already dismissed easily. Street youth, drag queens, trans and gender non-conforming people, working-class gay men, lesbians, people of colour, people with few protections, people whose lives did not fit the early movement's polished public image. That does not mean only those people mattered, or that more protected gay people were absent. The crowd was mixed, and memory has argued over who stood where, but it is clear that many of the people most exposed to police harassment were central to the force of the night. People with less to lose are sometimes described as reckless by people who have more to protect. But another way to say it is that they understood the street because the street had been dealing with them long before anyone called Stonewall historic. I want to be careful with the legends here. You may have heard people ask who threw the first brick. That question has become famous, almost too famous, because it tries to place a collective uprising into one hand. Was it a brick? Was it a bottle? Was it a coin first? Was it a parking meter later? Was the first decisive act a punch, a shove, a shout, a refusal, a question from a handcuffed person, an object thrown by someone whose name was never recorded? The honest answer is that the first pushback was collective enough and chaotic enough that no single story can carry it all. That may feel less satisfying than a legend. It is also more respectful. Stonewall belongs not to one perfect first, but to the many people who stayed when leaving would have been easier. The police had misread the crowd because the old expectations no longer worked. They expected embarrassment to thin the numbers. It did not. They expected fear to quiet the sidewalk. It did not. They expected those released to protect themselves by vanishing. Some did, but enough did not. They expected a gay bar raid to remain a gay bar raid. Contained, shameful, routine. Instead, it became a street confrontation visible to anyone nearby. The crowd had learned something about itself, and the police learned it at almost the same time. The people outside were not simply upset. They were willing to make the officers afraid. This reversal must have felt almost impossible to the people who had lived through so many years of being the ones afraid. Imagine carrying fear in your body for so long that it becomes part of how you stand. You fear the police, you fear exposure, you fear laughter from strangers, you fear losing your job, you fear being touched by someone with authority and having no one believe you. You fear the newspaper, you fear the phone call home. Then, for 1 hour on one street, the fear changes direction. The officers are the ones backing up. The officers are the ones behind a door. The officers are the ones waiting for help. That does not erase the danger. In some ways, it increases it. But it changes the moral weather of the night. The tactical patrol force eventually arrived in formation, and when they came, the conflict took another shape. Helmets, batons, lines of officers moving through the narrow streets, trying to clear people who had already discovered how unwilling they were to be cleared. But even before the larger police response, the essential break had happened. The crowd had refused dispersal. It had turned humiliation into confrontation. It had taken the symbols of the raid, the wagons, the doorway, the coins, the bar itself, and made them part of a public refusal. The first push back was not clean enough to be made harmless. That is why it mattered. It did not ask permission. It did not wait for a microphone. It did not use the language respectable people had decided was acceptable. It came from a crowd that had been told too many times to accept the old routine and had found, in the heat of that night, that the routine could be broken. Coins hit the street and police vehicles. Bottles followed. Shouts rose. People pushed, laughed, cursed, helped one another, pulled back, surged forward again. The crowd did not leave, and by not leaving it created the condition for everything that came next. There is a difference between being brave and being unable to bear one more insult. Stonewall contained both. Some people were brave, some were angry, some were drunk, some were frightened, some were protecting friends, some were following the energy of the crowd, some were discovering in real time that they had reached the end of obedience. Movements are often born from mixtures like that, not from purified motives. The night did not wait for everyone to become noble. It used what was there: heat, music cut short, police roughness, street youth, old fear, fresh laughter, coins in pockets, bottles in hands, and a crowd that kept getting larger because people had finally found something more compelling than going home. By the time the police were barricaded inside the Stonewall Inn, the raid had stopped being a raid in the ordinary sense. It had become a challenge. The city had reached into a hidden room to perform its usual act of control, and the people outside had answered by making the hidden room the centre of a public fight. Christopher Street was no longer just a place where gay people slipped in and out of bars with one eye on the police. It was becoming a place where the police could be surrounded, mocked, driven backward, and made to wait. The street lights, the broken glass, the crowd noise, the sirens, the heat rising from the pavement, all of it gathered into a scene that nobody present could fully understand yet. And still the night was not over. Reinforcements were coming. The crowd would meet organised police lines with movement of its own. People would scatter and return. The narrow streets of Greenwich Village would make control harder than the officers expected. What had begun at the Stonewall doorway would spill into a larger confrontation, not only for a few minutes, but across nights, as Christopher Street became the place where a community that had been treated as a police problem began answering like a political force. The first night did not end cleanly. Nights like that almost never do. They loosen slowly in pieces, with people drifting away because they are exhausted, because they are frightened, because the police line has moved them back, because morning is beginning to make the street look different, because adrenaline cannot hold a body forever. By around 4 in the morning, much of Christopher Street had thinned. The sharpest part of the fighting had passed. The tactical patrol force had moved through the village streets with helmets, batons, and the confidence of officers trained to push crowds into motion. People had been chased, struck, scattered, and arrested. Windows had been broken. The Stonewall Inn had been damaged badly. The bar that had been crowded with music only a few hours earlier was burned, battered, wet, and exposed. What had begun as another raid had become something that nobody on that street could fit back into the ordinary language of police work. And still, when the worst of the noise faded, people did not simply vanish from the neighbourhood as if nothing had happened. Some sat on stoops. Some gathered near Christopher Park. Some walked in small groups, talking too fast, then falling quiet, then talking again. You can imagine the feeling if you have ever been part of something frightening that ended before your body understood it was over. The street is calmer, but your hands still feel charged. Your ears keep waiting for the next shout. You replay the same moments in no particular order. The police retreating into the Stonewall, the sound of glass, the coins hitting pavement, the crowd laughing, the crowd surging, someone running. Someone falling, someone asking whether a friend got away, someone saying they had never seen anything like it, someone else saying the same thing again because there was nothing else to say. The body searches for ordinary sentences after extraordinary stress, and ordinary sentences are usually too small. In the first light of Saturday morning, Christopher Street had to become a street again. That is one of the strange things about urban unrest. A place can be a battleground at 3 in the morning and a place where people buy coffee only a few hours later. Delivery trucks come through. Neighbours open curtains. Broken glass is noticed in daylight. The damage looks different when the sun reaches it. At night, a crowd can make a street feel like a single body. In the morning, the pavement returns to detail. Scorch marks, smashed glass, wet patches from hoses or spilled drinks or firefighting, the blackened front of the Stonewall, the smell of smoke and garbage and summer city heat. The place had been changed but not yet interpreted. People knew something had happened. They did not yet know what name it would have. News moved quickly through Greenwich Village. It moved by phone, by rumour, by newspapers, by people who had been there, by people who claimed they had been there, by people who had heard from someone who had been near enough to see something. Craig Rodwell, who owned the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookshop and was one of the people already connected to gay activism in the city, contacted newspapers while the first night was still unfolding. That mattered because events become harder to erase when someone makes sure they are reported. But printed coverage did not mean understanding. Newspapers could describe a disturbance and still miss the life behind it. They could use the language of disorder without explaining the order that had produced it. They could tell readers that police and homosexuals had clashed without making readers feel the years of raids, firings, arrests, medical labels, family rejections, and routine humiliations that had filled the street before the first object was thrown. All day Saturday, people came by to look. Some came because they had been there and needed to see the place again, as if seeing it in daylight would prove that the night had happened. Some came because they had heard stories and wanted to inspect the evidence. Some came because the Stonewall had been part of their life and now looked like an injured thing. The building had become a public object. The hidden room had lost its hiddenness. Graffiti appeared on the walls, blunt messages of anger and claim. People wrote phrases supporting gay power, drag power, legal gay bars, and the idea that rights had been invaded. The words were not polished. They were not designed for a museum wall. They were immediate, written by people who understood that the street itself had become part of the argument. If the police had used the raid to make the community visible through shame, the graffiti answered by making that visibility political. The Stonewall Inn reopened that Saturday night, which still feels startling when you think about it carefully. The place had been damaged, the raid had been violent, the police had just been fought in the street outside, and yet the bar opened again. That reopening was not a normal business decision in the ordinary sense. It was a signal whether anyone intended it that way or not. The doorway was still there. The people were still there. The place had not been erased by one night of police action. Of course, the Stonewall remained the same rough, corrupt, complicated establishment it had been before. It did not become noble because it had been attacked, but the meaning of entering it after the first night had changed. To walk back toward that door was no longer only to go to a bar. It was to step into the aftershock of a public refusal. By the time Saturday evening deepened, people were coming from all over. Some had been there the night before. Others arrived because the story had spread through the village and beyond it. There were regulars, street youth, gay men, lesbians, drag queens, trans and gender non-conforming people, activists, curious neighbours, political radicals, police watchers, tourists, and people drawn by the pure force of noise and rumour. That mixture made the street unstable in a new way. A crowd formed not only because people wanted to fight, but because people wanted to see one another in the open after a night when hiding had failed and something else had happened instead. The first night had shown that police could be resisted. The second night asked whether that resistance had been an accident. One of the most striking details remembered from that Saturday night was the sudden publicness of gay life on Christopher Street. People who had once entered bars through watched doors and peepholes were now outside in the street, not hiding their affection as carefully as before. Men kissed where they could be seen. People touched, embraced, stood close, laughed loudly, claimed space with their bodies. This was not the same as safety. Police were still present. Violence was still possible. Arrest was still possible. But public affection under those conditions was its own kind of confrontation. It challenged the old arrangement that gay life could exist only if it remained hidden enough to be denied. The street had become bright with presence, not because floodlights made it bright, but because people were letting themselves be seen. That public presence had practical danger in it. A person being seen could still be identified. A photograph could still carry risk. A witness could still talk, but something had changed in the calculation. For many, the danger of being seen had always been weighed against the danger of never being seen at all. On that Saturday night after the first uprising, the balance shifted. If enough people stood visibly together, the old loneliness could not do its work in the same way. That does not mean fear disappeared. It means fear had competition. Anger competed with it. Excitement competed with it. The strange relief of being surrounded by others competed with it. So did curiosity, pride, exhaustion, and the need to know whether the night before had been a break in history or only a burst of anger that would be punished back into silence. The police understood that the situation was no longer ordinary. More officers were present. The tactical patrol force returned in greater numbers. These were not officers sent to check identifications inside a bar. They were riot control police, trained to move as a unit, to clear streets, to push bodies backward with batons and formation. Their arrival changed the sound of the night. A loose crowd sounds different from a police formation. The crowd rises and falls, jokes, shouts, scatters, regroups, argues with itself. A police formation has rhythm. Boots, commands, clubs, shields, helmets, the discipline of force. For people who had already seen police retreat once, the arrival of the tactical patrol force was a reminder that the city had deeper reserves of power than the few officers trapped inside the Stonewall the night before. But Greenwich Village was not an easy place to control. Its streets did not offer the wide, simple geometry that police formations prefer. Christopher Street and the surrounding blocks bent and crossed in ways that allowed people to scatter and return. Protesters ran down side streets, slipped around corners, appeared behind police lines, vanished into doorways, and came back again. The very layout of the neighbourhood worked against a clean sweep. It turned the confrontation into a moving chase rather than a single cleared square. Officers could push people from one block only to find them gathering on another. The crowd did not need to defeat the police in a formal sense to frustrate them. It only needed to keep returning. There was humour again, even in the danger. That is one of the details that makes these nights so particular. Protesters formed a mocking kick line in front of riot police, using camp and performance as a street tactic. It was funny but not harmless. It turned the discipline of the police line into something ridiculous. It placed the gestures of theatre against the gestures of state force. The officers advanced with batons, and the crowd answered at times with movement that refused to look properly frightened. That kind of mockery can enrage authority because it denies authority the emotional response it expects. Police can handle fear. They know how to use it. They can handle anger. They know how to meet it with force. But ridicule is slippery. It makes the uniform look less inevitable. The second night grew more violent as police tried to clear the streets. People were hit with nightsticks. Some were grabbed and pulled into groups of officers. Others fled and circled back. Fires were started in trash cans. Cars and buses were stopped or surrounded. The crowd tested every boundary of the street. Some people were there from conviction, some from anger, some from the thrill of seeing police challenged, some because they did not want to abandon friends, some because the first night had opened a door inside them and they could not close it again by staying home. It would be false to make everyone's motive identical. Crowds do not work that way. But the shared fact remained. The people on Christopher Street had not been scared back indoors. As the hours moved on, the scene took on the quality of repeated collision. Police advanced. People ran. Police withdrew or shifted. People returned. The crowd shouted. The police charged. The street emptied for a moment, then filled again. A person watching from an apartment window might have seen the same corner change hand several times without anyone ever saying that was what was happening. In military histories, writers like clear lines, positions, manoeuvres, victories. Street history is messier. It is made of bodies and corners and timing. It is made of people knowing which doorway opens, which alley leads around, which officer is swinging hard, which friend is missing, which rumour is spreading, which chant has caught on. The nights after the first raid were not only about fighting, they were also about talking. In Christopher Park and on the sidewalks, people argued over what had happened and what should happen next. Some wanted continued confrontation, some wanted organisation, some wanted to make sure the anger became more than a weekend story. Some older activists worried that violence would damage the careful work already being done. Younger people often had less patience for caution. This tension mattered because it marked a shift in gay politics. The early homophile movement had worked hard to show that gay people could be orderly, respectable, and deserving of rights. The street was now saying something rougher. We are here whether or not you find us respectable. That did not erase the earlier work. It built on it, challenged it, and sometimes rejected its limits. By Sunday, the intensity changed, but the neighbourhood did not return to normal. People still came. They talked, watched, and processed. The Stonewall was no longer just a bar. Christopher Street was no longer just a place where gay people gathered at night under pressure. It had become a point of return. That is one way a protest space forms. People come back because something happened there, and because coming back proves the event is not finished. The first night could have been treated as an explosion. The later nights turned it into a continuing statement. Each return said that the city had not managed to frighten everyone away. Each gathering kept the story alive long enough for it to become shared memory. The press played an uncomfortable role in keeping the anger alive. The Village Voice had offices near the Stonewall, and its coverage became part of the conflict. Some of the language used in the reporting struck many gay readers and participants as mocking and contemptuous. That mattered because the Village Voice was not a faraway conservative paper from some distant place. It was part of the neighbourhood's cultural life. Its reporters were nearby. Its office was nearby. For people who had just fought police in the street, dismissive or insulting coverage from a local alternative paper felt like another kind of raid, not with batons this time, but with words. The paper had looked at them and still spoken with contempt. That insult brought people back again. Later in the week, crowds gathered near the Voice offices as well as around the Stonewall area. The anger widened from police action to public representation. How would gay people be described? Who had the authority to explain what had happened? Would the riot be reduced to disorder, treated as a joke, or used as proof of moral panic? These questions may sound like media criticism now, but in 1969 they were tied directly to survival. Public language shaped public danger. A newspaper could make ridicule respectable. It could turn a human crowd into a punchline. It could provide employers, police, and families with the vocabulary they needed to dismiss the people involved. So the fight over words was not separate from the fight in the street. It was part of it. The later confrontations did not repeat the first night exactly. They had their own rhythms, their own crowds, their own causes of escalation. By then, people had heard stories. Some came because they wanted to participate in what was already being called a rebellion. Some came because the area had become a spectacle. Some came because they were angry at the Voice. Some came because police were still there. And some came because the very act of gathering had become proof of a new possibility. The nights after Stonewall were not a single continuous riot in the simple sense. They were waves, intense confrontation, then thinning, then return. Rage, talk, performance, police response, retreat, reappearance, a pattern of refusal learning how to continue. There is a detail that is easy to miss if we focus only on numbers and police movements. Many people who returned to Christopher Street were also returning to one another. They were looking for faces from the night before. They were checking who had been arrested, who had been hurt, who had made it home, who had a story to tell. A crowd can be political and personal at the same time. The person beside you may be a comrade in a historical event, but they may also be the person who pulled you away from a baton, or told you where to run, or laughed with you when laughing seemed impossible. Those connections matter because they are how a sudden uprising becomes a community memory. People retell the night. They correct one another. They exaggerate. They argue. They remember. In that process, the event stops belonging only to those who happen to stand in one exact spot and begins to belong to a wider circle. For the police, the continuing crowds were a problem of control and image. A single raid gone wrong was bad enough. Repeated nights of unrest in Greenwich Village suggested that the old mechanisms were not working. The department could send more officers, and it did. It could use batons, and it did. It could chase people through the streets, and it did. But each confrontation risked proving the same point again. Gay people and those around them were no longer guaranteed to respond with silence. The city could still hurt them. It could still arrest them. It could still clear a block temporarily. But clearing a block is not the same as restoring obedience. Think about how different that felt from the private world before Stonewall. Before, the danger had often been individualized. Your job, your name, your arrest, your family, your secret, your shame. During the nights after the raid, those individual fears gathered into a public force. The crowd did not remove the private costs. People could still be injured or exposed. But the crowd made it harder for each person to believe they were carrying the whole burden alone. If the first night broke the routine, the following nights taught people that the break could be repeated. That lesson was powerful, because repetition is how new habits begin. Christopher Street became a battleground not because armies held it, but because different claims to reality met there. The police claimed the right to regulate, raid, disperse, and punish. The bar owners claimed profit from a community they did not protect. The newspapers claimed the right to describe the scene in their own language. The crowd claimed the right to stand in public and answer. Every curb, doorway, and corner became part of that contest. Who belongs here after dark? Who gets to dance? Who gets to touch? Who gets to name the event? Who gets to decide whether a crowd is a riot, a protest, a nuisance, a danger, or a beginning? No one on those nights could answer all of that. Most people were simply moving through the immediate demands of the street. Run now, come back later, watch the police line, help that person up, find out who was arrested, tell someone what happened, read the paper and get angry, return to Christopher Street because staying away feels like letting the story be taken. Historical meaning came later, but the raw material of meaning was already there. It was in the repeated return. It was in the public affection. It was in the anger at the press. It was in the refusal to let police make gay gathering invisible again. It was in the discovery that a community many Americans imagined as weak, shameful, or hidden could fill a street and hold it, if only for a while. By the time the nights of unrest had run their course, the Stonewall Inn itself was no longer the same kind of place. It would not remain open for long in its old form. The building had been damaged, and the conditions that had produced it were already shifting. But the address had changed meaning. Not officially yet. Not with a plaque. Not with a monument. Not with speeches by politicians. Its meaning changed first in the minds of the people who had seen police retreat, who had watched the crowd return, who had stood in the street under threat and felt something new moving through the old fear. The place became a reference point. Were you there? Did you hear? Did you see what happened? Are we going back? That last question mattered most. Are we going back? Not only back to the street, but back to the old way of living. Back to raids treated as private misfortune. Back to organisations that spoke too softly for the anger now loose in the room. Back to newspapers that could mock gay people without being answered. Back to hiding as the only available strategy. Of course, no one could leave hiding behind in a single week. The laws did not change overnight. Jobs were still at risk. Families still rejected children. Police still harassed gay people. The medical establishment still carried its old labels. America did not wake up after Stonewall suddenly fair or kind. That is not how history works. But after those nights, many people found it harder to believe that the old silence was permanent. In the days and weeks that followed, the energy of Christopher Street began moving into meetings, arguments, organising and plans. People who had been in the street wanted language equal to what they had felt there. Some would form new groups with a more confrontational spirit than earlier organisations. Others would continue the work already begun, but with a changed sense of what was possible. The street had not written a programme, but it had created urgency. It had shown that the anger was real and shared. It had shown that public defiance could draw people rather than only destroy them. It had shown that gay liberation, as a phrase and as a demand, could speak to people who had not seen themselves in the older, quieter forms of activism. Christopher Street slowly settled back into traffic, nightlife, arguments, rent, work, and ordinary city weather. Streets always do. But something had been left there. Not a permanent victory, not a finished movement, a memory with practical uses. People could point to it. They could say the police came and we fought back. They could say the crowd returned. They could say the newspapers mocked us and we answered. They could say that in the summer of 1969, for several nights, the old fear did not control the whole street. That kind of memory does not stay still. It gets carried into rooms, meetings, leaflets, marches, friendships, and decisions. It becomes a reason someone who once stayed quiet decides to speak. It becomes a reason someone who once felt alone decides to find the others. The nights after the raid did not end the struggle. They made it harder to pretend the struggle was only private. That was the change Christopher Street forced into public view. A police raid had opened a door expecting to expose shame. Instead, it exposed a community that was angry, divided, funny, vulnerable, brave, reckless, wounded, and ready for something larger than survival in the dark. The street became a battleground because people kept coming back to it, and by coming back they turned a local clash into a signal. The signal moved slowly at first, through word of mouth, through small newspapers, through activist networks, through people who had been there telling people who had not. Then it moved farther, and as it moved, the question waiting beyond the broken glass became harder to avoid. What do you build after a night like that, when going back to the way things were no longer feels possible? When the smoke cleared on Christopher Street, the street did not become quiet in the old way. It may have looked quieter at certain hours. The broken glass could be swept, the police wagons could leave, the crowds could thin, the Stonewall Inn itself could stop being the centre of a fight and become, again, a damaged building on a narrow village street. But something had been disturbed that could not be repaired with a broom or a police report. The old arrangement between fear and silence had been broken in public. Not ended everywhere, not defeated for good. That would be much too simple. But broken enough that people who had lived for years with their anger folded carefully inside them now had a recent memory of what it felt like when that anger was shared. That memory mattered. It gave shape to a question that had been waiting beneath the raids and the private jokes and the careful letters and the soft-spoken meetings. What now? That is the question that often follows an uprising, though people do not always know they are asking it at first. The body asks it before the mind does. What do you do with the energy that remains after the shouting stops? What do you do with the people who came out into the street and found one another there? What do you do with the proof that the police can be resisted, even briefly, even messily, even at great risk? Do you let it become a story told only in bars, growing larger and stranger until it becomes half memory and half legend? Do you let newspapers name it for you? Do you return to the older organisations and ask them to make room for this new impatience? Or do you build something else, something rougher, louder, less willing to ask permission to exist? For some people, the answer was simply survival. That should not be skipped over. Not everyone who lived through the Stonewall nights immediately became an organiser. Not everyone had the safety, time, money, health, or temperament for meetings. Some people went back to jobs where they were still closeted. Some went back to families who would never understand where they had been. Some went back to the street, to unstable rooms, to hustling, to the same dangers they had faced before. Some were nursing injuries. Some were watching for police attention. Some were trying to make sense of whether what they had done was brave, reckless, necessary, or all three. History sometimes moves too quickly from rebellion to organisation, as if the people in the street instantly became a movement with minutes and committees. In truth, many first had to get through the next day, but others felt the need to organise almost immediately. They understood that the nights on Christopher Street had created attention, and attention is perishable. It fades unless someone gives it structure. A crowd can force a moment open, but a movement has to decide what to do with the opening. That is not glamorous work. It means finding rooms to meet in. It means arguments over wording. It means who gets to speak, who gets interrupted, who is considered respectable enough, who is considered too radical, who is asked to wait, who refuses to wait. It means leaflets, phone calls, mailing lists, borrowed typewriters, folding chairs, late nights, bad coffee, nervous new faces, old activists with experience, younger people with impatience, and the difficult act of turning heat into direction. In the weeks after the uprising, new organising began to take shape in New York. The Gay Liberation Front emerged out of that post-Stonewall energy, and even the name was a sign that something had changed. Gay Liberation Front did not sound like a request for tolerance. It sounded like the language of the late 1960s, the language of anti-war organising, civil rights struggle, black power, women's liberation, and anti-colonial movements around the world. The word liberation carried weight. It did not mean please be nicer to us. It did not mean we are just like you if only you get to know us. It meant the problem was larger than misunderstanding. It meant the problem was power. It meant gay people were not merely asking to be included in a society that had harmed them. They were questioning the society that had made hiding necessary in the first place. This was a deep shift from much of the earlier homophile movement. Earlier groups such as the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Blitis had done courageous work in a far more hostile climate. They had created newsletters, support networks, legal strategies, discussion groups, and public protests when even small visibility carried real danger. Their carefulness was not weakness. It was a tactic built under pressure. Men in suits and women in dresses standing in disciplined picket lines were not being timid. They were trying to survive while making a claim on citizenship. But after Stonewall, many younger activists found that style too narrow. They did not want to prove that gay people could be respectable according to the standards of the people who had despised them. They wanted to challenge the standards themselves. You can feel the tension in that difference. One group says, we must appear orderly or they will dismiss us. Another says, they dismiss us anyway, so why should we let them decide the terms of our dignity? One group says, change comes through careful persuasion. Another says, careful persuasion has left too many people beaten, arrested, fired, and alone. Both positions came from experience, both came from fear, both came from hope. Movements are not born united. They are born arguing because the people inside them have been hurt in different ways and protected by different strategies. Stonewall did not erase those differences. It brought them into a room where they could no longer be ignored. The meetings after Stonewall were often crowded and intense. People came because they had been at the riots. People came because they had missed them and felt that something was starting. People came because they were lonely. People came because they were angry at police, at newspapers, at doctors, at employers, at families, at churches, at the private fear that had governed their lives for too long. Some wanted immediate street action. Some wanted legal reform. Some wanted alliances with other radical movements. Some wanted a gay revolution in the deepest sense, a transformation not just of laws, but of daily life, sex, gender, family, and authority. Others were uneasy with that breadth. They wanted focused goals, something clearer, something that could be explained to city officials or printed in a newspaper without sounding like a threat to everything. The fact that they disagreed did not mean the movement was failing. It meant people were finally speaking openly enough to disagree. One of the most important things that changed after Stonewall was the relationship to visibility. Before, visibility had often been a danger to be managed. After, it increasingly became a tactic. Not for everyone, not all at once, not without cost. But the idea that gay people should enter public space as gay people gained force. That sounds obvious now only because later generations inherited the result of that fight. In 1969, to be publicly gay could still mean losing work, family, housing, safety and freedom. So when activists insisted on visibility, they were not simply making a slogan. They were asking people to step toward the very danger that had structured their lives. That is a profound request. It can empower and it can frighten. It can save someone from isolation and it can expose them to harm. The movement had to live inside that tension. The phrase, out of the closets and into the streets, captured something essential about the new mood. The closet was not only a private hiding place, it was a social arrangement. It allowed straight society to pretend gay people were rare, tragic, criminal, or invisible. It allowed families to avoid difficult conversations. It allowed employers to discriminate quietly. It allowed politicians to ignore a constituency that had not yet been forced into public view. To come into the streets was to disrupt that arrangement. A street is harder to deny than a rumour. A crowd is harder to dismiss than a secret. When gay people gathered publicly, they turned private identity into a public fact, and public facts demand some kind of answer. At the same time, organising meant deciding who was included in that public fact. This was not simple. The people at Stonewall had included gay men, lesbians, drag queens, street youth, trans and gender non-conforming people, people of colour, working class people, and others whose lives did not fit neatly into one label. The politics that followed had to wrestle with that variety. Some activists wanted broad liberation that challenged gender roles, racism, sexism, capitalism, police power, and sexual repression together. Others wanted narrower gay rights goals. Lesbians inside male-dominated gay organisations often had to fight to be heard. Trans and gender non-conforming people, so visible in street life and so vulnerable to police harassment, were often pushed aside when movements sought respectability. The question of who gets remembered as central and who gets treated as inconvenient began early. It has never fully gone away. That does not make the movement after Stonewall false. It makes it human. People who have been marginalised can still marginalise others. People fighting shame can still carry old hierarchies into new rooms. A movement can be necessary and flawed at the same time. The task is not to smooth those flaws away. It is to see them clearly, so that the people most exposed to danger do not vanish from the story, once the story becomes presentable. The street youth who stayed outside the Stonewall, the drag queens who faced police ridicule, the lesbians who resisted being handled, the trans and gender non-conforming people whose bodies made hiding harder. They were not decorative details around a movement built by others. They were part of the force that made the uprising impossible to ignore. By December 1969, another organisation formed in New York, the Gay Activists Alliance. It emerged from people who wanted a more focused group dedicated specifically to gay rights, less tied to the broad coalition politics of the Gay Liberation Front. Its tactics would become known for direct action, including confrontational public demonstrations often called ZAPs, designed to embarrass officials, interrupt business as usual, and force attention onto gay rights issues. This was another sign of the new post-Stonewall politics. The old quiet channels were no longer enough for many activists. If officials ignored polite requests, activists would make ignoring them more difficult. They would show up where they were not expected. They would disrupt the performance of normalcy that allowed discrimination to continue without visible cost. There is something practical in that kind of activism. It recognises that power often depends on routine. A politician holds an event and expects applause. A government office processes complaints slowly, if at all. A television programme speaks about gay people without gay people present. A newspaper uses contemptuous language and expects no organised response. A zap interrupts that comfort. It says the people you are discussing are here. It says the issue you would rather delay has a body and a voice. It says the old distance between the decision makers and the people affected by their decisions is closing. To people who valued order above justice, this looked rude. To people who had been politely ignored, rudeness could look like a tool. The year after Stonewall became a test of whether memory could be turned into action. Anniversaries can be sentimental, but they can also be strategic. The first anniversary of the uprising offered organisers a date, a place, and a reason to gather openly. June 28, 1970 became Christopher Street Liberation Day in New York. The march began in Greenwich Village and moved uptown towards Central Park. It was not yet the polished pride parade many people know today. It was more uncertain than that. Organisers did not know how many people would come. Some feared violence, some feared embarrassment. Some feared that people would gather at the starting point and then lose courage when it came time to march openly through the city. That fear was reasonable. A person could believe in liberation and still feel their stomach tighten at the thought of walking publicly as gay in broad daylight. At first, some marchers were hesitant. The line was not enormous at the beginning. People looked around, they measured the risk. Then, as the march moved, more joined. That is one of the most moving patterns in public protest. People standing on the edge watch others take the risk first. Then they decide, perhaps in a second, that they cannot remain only witnesses. They step off the sidewalk, the march grows, the act of walking becomes contagious. By the time the procession reached Central Park, it had become far larger than many organisers expected. What began as commemoration became demonstration. The hidden room had become a public route through the city. Think about that distance. A year earlier, people had been forced out of a dark bar under police pressure. Now people were walking in daylight, not because they had been exposed, but because they had chosen to be seen. The contrast is almost too clear. In 1969, the police had opened the door of the Stonewall intending to make people vulnerable. In 1970, gay people and their allies opened themselves to the city as a form of power. The route from Christopher Street to Central Park was not only geography, it was a change in posture. The marchers did not have to pretend that fear was gone. They walked with fear, and that is often what courage actually looks like. Similar commemorations and marches took place in other cities around that time, including Los Angeles and Chicago, showing that the energy of Stonewall had travelled beyond New York. This matters because Stonewall's significance was not only what happened on Christopher Street, but how quickly it became usable elsewhere. People in other cities could point to it and say that belongs to us too, not because they had been physically present, but because the conditions that produced it were familiar. Police raids were not unique to New York. Bar harassment was not unique to New York. Job discrimination, family rejection, medical stigma, and legal danger were not unique to New York. The spark had a local address, but the fuel existed across the country. From that point forward, the movement did not move in a straight line. It never does. There were victories and backlash, coalitions and splits, courage and exclusion, public marches and private grief. Some people wanted assimilation, the right to live ordinary lives without fear. Others wanted liberation, a deeper remaking of society's rules about gender, sex, family, work and authority. Some wanted both, depending on the day. The movement would fight police harassment, employment discrimination, psychiatric classification, censorship, military exclusion, housing discrimination, custody battles, immigration barriers, and the ordinary cruelty that does not always fit into a legal category. Stonewall did not solve these problems. It gave many people a new way to face them together. There is a temptation to say that after Stonewall, shame became pride. That is partly true, but too smooth. Shame does not disappear in one march. It lingers in families, workplaces, bedrooms, and bodies. It can survive even after someone says all the right words. Pride, in the beginning, was not the easy emotion printed later on merchandise. It was a disciplined refusal. It was a decision to act as if you were not ashamed, even while part of you still heard the old voices. It was public practice. Stand here. Say this. Hold this sign. Walk with us. Kiss here. Put your name on the leaflet. Attend the meeting. Do not apologise when the camera turns toward you. Over time, the practice of not bowing your head could become something like pride. But it had to be practiced because shame had been practiced for years. The movement that grew after Stonewall was built from that practice. It was built from people learning to speak in rooms where they once would have been silent. It was built from arguments that went late into the night because everyone knew the stakes were personal. It was built from newsletters that carried news from one city to another. It was built from bookstores, bars, apartments, church basements, college rooms, street corners, and borrowed offices. It was built from people who had been activists before Stonewall and people who became activists because of it. It was built from people whose names became famous and people whose names never entered the record. A movement is always larger than the names that survive. When we look back now, it is easy to see the march, the organisations, the slogans, and the eventual legal changes as if they were waiting inside the riot from the beginning. They were not. They had to be made. Someone had to call the meeting. Someone had to stay after the meeting and stack chairs. Someone had to argue over the flyer. Someone had to raise money. Someone had to comfort the person who panicked before speaking publicly. Someone had to answer the hostile phone call. Someone had to visit the person in jail. Someone had to challenge the newspaper. Someone had to risk telling the truth at work. Someone had to be the first in a family to say the word gay without lowering their voice. These are not dramatic acts in the way broken glass is dramatic, but without them, the uprising remains only an event. With them, it becomes a movement. After the smoke cleared then, the real difficulty began. Fighting back for a night is one kind of courage. Building something afterward is another. The first is hot, immediate, carried by the crowd. The second is slower and often lonelier. It asks people to return when there is no siren, no adrenaline, no dramatic proof that history is watching. It asks them to write, plan, listen, disagree, compromise, refuse compromise, and keep showing up. The people who built gay liberation after Stonewall had to do both kinds of work. They had to remember the street without becoming trapped in the romance of the street. They had to turn anger into organisations without letting organisations drain the anger entirely. They had to keep the door open for people who had never been welcomed into movements before, even when they failed at that task. The Stonewall uprising became a symbol because it gave people a story they could carry. Not a perfect story, not the first story, not the only story, a usable story, a story of people who were supposed to be quiet and were not. A story of a raid that did not end the way raids were supposed to end. A story of a street that became a place of return. A story that could be told in meetings, printed on flyers, remembered on anniversaries, and used to bring frightened people into public life. Movements need stories because facts alone do not gather people. A story gives the facts a direction. Stonewall gave the movement a direction that pointed outward, from the hidden room to the street. And now, as the months after the uprising move toward that first anniversary march, you can feel the old world and the new one overlapping. The laws are still there. The prejudice is still there. The police are still there. The fear is still real. But so is the memory of refusal. So are the new organisations. So are the meetings crowded with people who, only a short time earlier, might have believed they were alone. So is the idea that gay life does not have to survive only in bars with covered windows and warning lights. It can step into daylight, imperfectly, nervously, loudly, and begin to claim the space that had always been denied. The smoke has cleared from Christopher Street, but the air has not returned to what it was. Something is moving through it now, from the bar to the meeting room, from the meeting room to the march, from the march into the long years ahead, when the memory of Stonewall will keep asking what kind of freedom people are willing to build after they have finally learned to say no. The long echo of Stonewall did not sound the same in every decade. At first it was close to the street. It lived in the memory of people who had been there, people who had heard the glass break, people who had seen police retreat into the bar, people who had returned on the following nights because they could not stay away. It lived in meetings where the old language of caution no longer seemed large enough. It lived in the first anniversary march when people walked in daylight and discovered that visibility, once forced on them by police raids, could also be chosen as an act of power. Then, slowly, the echo moved outward. It entered newspapers, organisations, courtrooms, classrooms, family conversations, campaign speeches, city landmarks, national parks, and finally the broad public memory of the United States. But every time it moved farther from Christopher Street, something became easier to forget. The street itself, the heat, the fear, the fact that the people who fought back did not know they were becoming symbols. They were trying to get through a night that had become impossible to endure quietly. That is one of the first things Stonewall still asks us to remember. The people there were not monuments. They were not polished representatives of a cause. They were not carefully selected to look good in history. They were people in a bar, people on a sidewalk, people who had been living under laws and customs that treated them as criminals, threats, jokes, patients, sinners and problems. Some were young, some were older, some were white, some were black or Latino, some were middle class, some had almost nothing. Some were gay men who could pass in daylight if they were careful. Some were lesbians who had learned how quickly a woman could be punished for refusing the role expected of her. Some were drag queens, trans people, and gender non-conforming people, whose visibility made them especially vulnerable to police attention. Some had jobs to lose. Some had already lost the protection of family, home and steady work. They did not all share the same risk, but they shared enough of the same pressure to recognise what was happening when the police came through the door. Over time, public memory likes to simplify that kind of crowd. It wants a clear cast of heroes. It wants one person to throw the first brick, one sentence to start the riot, one group to carry the meaning, one anniversary to explain the movement. The real event resists that. It was collective, confused, argued over, remembered differently by different witnesses, and shaped by people whose names were not written down. This makes the story harder to tell, but it also makes it more honest. Many of the most important people in history are not remembered as individuals because nobody in power thought to record them. They appear only as a crowd, a chant, a line in a police report, a description in a newspaper, a face in the background of someone else's photograph. Stonewall asks us to take those unnamed people seriously. A movement does not begin only when a famous person gives a speech. Sometimes it begins when people whose names history will lose decide not to move. The official recognition came much later. The Stonewall site would eventually be listed, landmarked, protected, and interpreted as a place of national significance. Visitors would come to Christopher Park and the old Stonewall address with an understanding that they were standing near the birthplace of something important in modern LGBTQ history. That recognition matters. Places need protection. Public memory needs physical anchors. A plaque can tell a passerby that something happened here. A monument can say that this story belongs inside the national story, not outside it. But recognition also brings a danger of tidiness. Once a place becomes official, people may imagine that the struggle it represents has been safely completed. The Rough Bar becomes a landmark. The street fight becomes a lesson. The riot becomes a ceremony. The ceremony becomes comfortable. Stonewall asks us not to let comfort erase conflict. Because Stonewall was conflict. It began with police power. It began with a raid. It began in a country where gay people could be arrested, exposed, fired, institutionalized, rejected and humiliated for trying to live openly. It involved broken windows, thrown objects, shouting, fear, anger, and people making decisions in the middle of chaos. It was not designed to be respectable. It was not designed at all. That is part of its value. The event reminds us that people do not always resist oppression, in the form that later observers find easiest to praise. A person who has been denied dignity may not sound polite when dignity is taken again. A crowd that has been pushed too often may push back in ways that unsettle people, who prefer change without disruption. Stonewall asks us to be honest about that. Not to romanticize every act, not to pretend danger was not danger, but to remember that the demand for perfect behaviour has often been used to delay justice. It also asks us to remember that Stonewall was not the first act of LGBTQ resistance. This matters deeply. Earlier activists had already been organising, writing, picketing, meeting and risking exposure. There had been resistance in other cities before 1969. There had been people challenging police harassment and government discrimination long before the Stonewall Inn became famous. If we say everything began at Stonewall, we accidentally erase the people who prepared the ground. We erase the slow work that made the sudden uprising possible. We erase the newsletters, court challenges, careful protests, private support networks, and brave conversations that created a world in which a crowd could understand itself as more than isolated individuals. Stonewall was not the first spark in darkness. It was the fire that many people finally saw. At the same time, Stonewall was different because of what followed. The years after the uprising saw a rapid expansion of gay liberation politics. The first anniversary marches gave people a repeated public ritual of memory and demand. Organisations formed with new urgency. The language changed. People began saying liberation, pride, power, and coming out in ways that carried a more open challenge to the old order. The closet, once treated as private necessity, became a public issue. The bar, once hidden behind darkened windows and watched doors, became a route into the street. This transformation did not happen to everyone at once. Many people remained closeted because they had to. Many still faced real consequences for visibility. But after Stonewall, the idea that secrecy should be the permanent condition of gay life became hard to defend. That is another part of the echo. Stonewall did not remove fear, but it changed the relationship some people had to fear. Before, fear often worked alone. It sat inside a person's body as a private warning. Do not say too much. Do not look too long. Do not keep that letter. Do not use the real name. Do not go to that bar unless you know the door. Do not trust the police. Do not tell your family. Do not risk your job. After Stonewall, fear was still there, but it had to share space with memory. People could remember that they had not always obeyed. They could remember that a crowd had formed. They could remember that the police had been answered. That memory did not make anyone safe by itself, but it made isolation less complete. A frightened person who knows there are others is different from a frightened person who believes they are alone. In the decades that followed, LGBTQ Americans would face many other struggles. The fight against psychiatric classification continued. Employment discrimination remained a daily reality. Police harassment did not vanish. Families still rejected children. Churches still condemned. Politicians still used gay people as warnings in speeches about national decline. The military, immigration system, schools, hospitals and courts all became sites of conflict. Then came the AIDS crisis, and with it a level of grief and neglect that would mark a generation. Stonewall did not prevent those tragedies. It did not make the government compassionate. It did not make the press fair. It did not make families brave. But the tradition of direct action, public mourning, street protest, and refusing official silence that grew in the years after Stonewall became one of the tools later activists would use. The echo of Christopher Street could be heard again whenever people refused to let death, shame, or neglect remain private. This is why memory matters. Not memory as decoration, not memory as a safe anniversary post, memory as equipment. A community remembers because forgetting makes it easier for old patterns to return under new names. The raids may not look the same, the language may change, the laws may shift. But the old questions keep reappearing. Who is allowed to gather? Who is allowed to be named? Who gets police protection? And who gets police suspicion? Who is treated as part of the public and who is treated as a problem in public space? Who gets remembered as respectable enough to honour? And who is pushed to the side because their life makes later audiences uncomfortable? Stonewall does not answer these questions once and for all. It keeps placing them in front of us. There is also a personal question inside the public history. What does it mean to be seen? For the people at Stonewall, being seen was dangerous. Police raids forced visibility as punishment. Newspapers could turn visibility into shame. Families could turn it into rejection. Employers could turn it into unemployment. But the movement that followed tried to turn visibility into power. That change was not simple. Visibility can still be costly. Not everyone can step into it safely. Some people must still measure what they say, where they live, who they trust, and what risks they can afford. Stonewall asks us to respect both truths at once. There is power in coming out, and there can be danger in being forced out. There is courage in public life, and there is also courage in surviving privately when the world has not made public life safe. When people visit Stonewall today, They may see a historic place surrounded by the ordinary life of the city. That ordinariness is important. The street has traffic. People pass with groceries, coffee, phones, dogs, appointments, plans. Someone may walk by without knowing the details. Someone else may stop because the name means everything to them. That is how historic places live. They do not freeze the world around them. They sit inside daily life, quietly asking the passerby to notice that ordinary places can hold extraordinary pressure. A bar can be a refuge. A doorway can be a boundary between hiding and exposure. A small park can be a gathering place. A street can become a battleground. A night can become a reference point for generations who are not yet born. But if Stonewall has become easier to honour, it should not become easy to use. There is a difference. Honouring Stonewall means more than saying that a riot happened and freedom followed. Freedom did not simply follow. People built it in uneven, unfinished ways. They fought within their own movements over race, gender, class, respectability, strategy, and who counted as part of the community. They made mistakes. They left people out. They repaired some of those exclusions and repeated others. Stonewall asks us to remember the movement as human, not pure. A pure movement is simple to praise and impossible to learn from. A human movement shows us the work still required. It asks us especially to remember the people at the edges, the street youth who did not have safe homes to return to, the drag queens whose courage was sometimes celebrated in the street and dismissed in the meeting room, the trans and gender non-conforming people whose lives challenged not only homophobia, but the deeper rules about gender that many Americans were not ready to question. The lesbians who fought both public hatred and male dominance inside activist spaces. The people of colour who faced racism in the wider world and often inside gay communities too. The poor, the homeless, the arrested, the mocked, the unnamed. If Stonewall becomes only a story of eventual acceptance, those people disappear first. The long echo asks us not to let them. There is something else worth holding here. Stonewall was not only about anger. Anger was there, clearly, and it had every reason to be there. But underneath the anger was the desire for ordinary life, the right to dance, the right to gather, the right to walk home without being stopped, the right to love someone without turning every sentence into camouflage, the right to have a favourite place, a group of friends, a bad drink, a song, a Saturday night, a future. Movements are often described through legal goals, and legal goals matter. But people rarely risk themselves only for policy language. They risk themselves because they want to live. The people at Stonewall fought back in defence of a life that outsiders had treated as disposable, but that was full of the same ordinary needs everyone has: company, touch, laughter, shelter, recognition, and rest. Maybe that is why the story continues to travel. Not because every listener knows the exact laws of 1969 New York, or the names of every organisation that followed, or the details of every night of unrest, but because the basic human shape is recognisable. A group of people pushed too long, a place where they felt briefly less alone, an authority that came in expecting obedience, a crowd that stayed, a refusal that surprised even some of the people refusing. That is not a complete political history, but it is a powerful human one. It explains why the name Stonewall can carry meaning far beyond the walls of the original bar. And still, we should resist making the story too clean. The Stonewall Inn itself was not a perfect sanctuary. It was run through exploitation and corruption. The movement that followed did not include everyone equally. Pride became, over time, many different things at once. Protest, celebration, memory, market, argument, homecoming, and for some, disappointment. The long echo of Stonewall includes all of that. It includes the joy of public celebration and the discomfort of remembering that the first Pride was tied to police violence and street resistance. It includes official recognition and the worry that official recognition can soften the event too much. It includes gratitude for progress and the knowledge that progress is uneven, contested, and never guaranteed. So what does Stonewall still ask us to remember? It asks us to remember that people can be treated as powerless for so long that even they may underestimate what they're carrying. It asks us to remember that hiding is not the same as consent. It asks us to remember that laughter can be a weapon, that public space matters, that ordinary places become historic because ordinary people fill them with risk. It asks us to remember that movements are built by those who organise afterward as much as by those who fight in the first hour. It asks us to remember the people whose names were recorded and the people whose names were lost. It asks us not to confuse a monument with an ending. If you're listening tonight from somewhere quiet with the lights low, maybe it is worth picturing Christopher Street not as a symbol first, but as a real street on a hot night. The door of the bar, the police vehicles, the crowd not leaving, the sound of coins hitting pavement, the sudden knowledge moving through people that the old routine had broken. Then picture the same street years later, with visitors, flags, flowers, arguments, photographs, and people still asking what the event means. Both images belong together, the riot and the remembrance, the fear and the pride, the rough shelter and the national monument, the hidden room and the public march. History does not hand us clean inheritances, it gives us complicated ones and asks what we will do with them. Stonewall's inheritance is complicated because it began in a place that was necessary and unsafe, with people who were brave and frightened, in a movement that was liberating and flawed. That is why it remains useful. It does not let us imagine that freedom arrives fully formed. It shows freedom being made in confusion, in argument, in damaged rooms, in streets that would not clear, in meetings that lasted too long, in marches that began with fear and grew as people stepped off the curb. It shows that the work of being seen, and of making room for others to be seen, is not finished by one night, one anniversary, one law, or one plaque. The long echo is still moving. It moves whenever someone learns the story for the first time and realises that pride did not begin as a party handed down by permission. It moves whenever someone asks why the most vulnerable people in a community are often remembered last, though they were in danger first. It moves whenever a person who has been taught to shrink finds others and stands a little differently. It moves whenever history refuses to stay in the past because the questions it raises are still present. Stonewall is not only a place we look back at, it is a place that looks back at us, asking whether we are remembering the whole crowd, whether we are protecting the people still pushed toward the edges, whether we understand that the right to live openly was never given as a gift. It was demanded, and the demand began again and again, in voices that were tired of whispering on a street that had finally heard enough.